Get comfortable. If you've got a blanket nearby, now is the time to pull it a little closer. We're going to spend the next few hours wandering through the wasteland together, and there's no rush to get anywhere. The world of Fallout is one of the richest, strangest, most meticulously built fictional universes in gaming history. Decades of lore, hundreds of developers, thousands of decisions made in quiet offices that ended up shaping something enormous and enduring. Tonight we're going to move through all of it slowly, not as a quiz or a race, but as a long, unhurried story, the kind you sink into. So let's start at the very beginning. Part 1. The world that almost wasn't the origins of Fallout. There's a version of history where Fallout never exists at all. In that version, a programmer named Tim Kaine finishes his work at Interplay Entertainment, moves on to something else, and the post-apocalyptic wasteland remains just one of many unexplored corners of the video game medium. The franchise that would sell tens of millions of copies, spawn multiple sequels, get adapted into a hit television series, and leave a permanent mark on role-playing game design simply doesn't happen. But that's not the version we live in. In the version we live in, Tim Kaine woke up at 6 in the morning every single day, usually to a cat sitting on his chest. He drove to Interplay's offices in Irvine, California, and sat down at his desk before most of his colleagues had arrived. He coded in the silence of the early hours, trying to get as much done as possible before the day's meetings began. He left around 7 in the evening. He went home. He kept working until 10. And then he started over the next morning. He did this for about 2 years. The story of how Fallout came to exist is the story of one person's almost unreasonable dedication to something he believed in, combined with a chain of accidents and coincidences that led to one of the most beloved game series in history. Interplay Entertainment in the mid-1990s was a company with history. Founded by Brian Fargo in 1983, it had built a reputation on games like The Bard's Tale and Wasteland, a 1988 post-apocalyptic role-playing game set in a devastated American Southwest. Wasteland was the kind of game that players remembered for years afterward. It had a moral complexity unusual for its time, letting you make decisions that actually had consequences, letting you fail in ways that felt meaningful. It developed a loyal following, and that following never quite forgot about it. But by the early 1990s, Interplay had grown. It had more projects, more staff, more corporate structure. The raw scrappiness of those early games was starting to give way to something more polished and, in some ways, more cautious. Tim Kaine arrived in this environment carrying a specific passion. He wanted to make a new game in the spirit of Wasteland. Not a sequel necessarily, but something that captured the same sense of moral weight, real consequence, and a world that felt genuinely dangerous and genuinely alive. He began working on a game engine, largely on his own, driven by what he later described as simply loving what he was doing. The original design for what would become Fallout was built around the GURPS system, which stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System. GURPS is a tabletop role-playing framework published by Steve Jackson Games, and it had gained a reputation for its flexibility and its deep simulation of real-world skills and capabilities. The idea was to license GURPS and build the game's mechanics on top of it. This would give Fallout a real-world grounding, a set of rules that players might already know from tabletop sessions, and a sense of depth that purely invented systems sometimes lacked. Work progressed for about a year with GURPS as the planned foundation. Kaine built, colleagues joined the project, and the game started to take shape. But then the GURPS license negotiations broke down. The exact details of why have been discussed in various interviews over the years, with general reference to creative disagreements about the tone and content of the game. Steve Jackson Games, according to accounts, was uncomfortable with some of the violence and dark content that Interplay was planning. The license was pulled. At this point, a lesser team might have abandoned the project or started over. Kaine's group did something different. They took the core principles of GURPS, the skills, the statistics, the simulation philosophy, and built their own original system from the ground up. They called it SPECIAL, an acronym for strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck. These 7 attributes would form the backbone of every Fallout game ever made. Your character in Fallout 1 has a special score. Your character in Fallout 4 has a special score. The system, created in a rush of necessity after a licensing deal fell through, became one of the most durable designs in RPG history. The name Fallout itself has a deceptively simple origin. The game was always going to be about a world after nuclear war, about the fallout from that catastrophe in both the literal and metaphorical sense. The title was settled on fairly early in development and it stuck, carrying exactly the right weight without trying too hard to be clever about it. There's something almost poetic about a franchise named after the consequence of an event rather than the event itself. The visual identity of Fallout was shaped by a very specific aesthetic decision. The team, drawing on Kane's instincts and the collective sensibility of the developing group, wanted the game to feel like the 1950s imagined the future. Not the future as we know it now, with smartphones and the internet and solar panels, but the future as people in 1957 genuinely expected it to arrive. Atomic power solving all problems, robots serving in every home, gleaming chrome and streamlined shapes, and the absolute confidence that technology was going to save everyone. This choice created the iconic visual tension at the heart of Fallout. The world looks like a dream of tomorrow, but it's been burned to ash. The cheerful propaganda and the chrome robots and the Nuka-Cola advertisements exist alongside irradiated craters and the bones of the dead. The contrast is not accidental. It was designed to be disturbing, and it works precisely because the pre-war aesthetic is so sincere and so complete. The influence of Wasteland was acknowledged openly by the team, but Fallout wasn't a sequel in any formal sense. Interplay didn't own the Wasteland intellectual property at this point, and the game was being built as something new. The spiritual debt was real, though. The post-apocalyptic American Southwest setting, the turn-based tactical combat, the emphasis on player choice with real consequences, the dark humor running underneath the seriousness, all of these owed something to Wasteland's groundwork. Interplay caught wind of just how promising the project was becoming and began staffing it up significantly. Before Fallout was even finished, they established a separate team to begin pitching a sequel. The goal was to have Fallout 2 ready within roughly a year of the first game shipping. Looking back at this from the perspective of knowing how game development actually works, this was almost comically ambitious. The final version of Fallout required solving a genuinely difficult technical and narrative problem. How do you build a game world that feels open and reactive, where players can genuinely choose their own path and have the world respond meaningfully, while also telling a coherent story with stakes? The solution the team arrived at was to give the player a pressing mission: find a water chip to save Vault 13's dwindling water supply within a time limit, while leaving enormous space for exploration, moral complexity, and side content that illuminated the world beyond that main quest. The time limit was controversial among the team. Some felt it was too restrictive. Others believed it created exactly the right kind of tension. In the final release, the time limit was fairly generous, giving players more than enough freedom to explore, but its presence shaped how the game felt in the early hours. The world was dying, your vault was depending on you, and you were wandering out into a wasteland you didn't understand. The pressure was there even when you were ignoring it. What emerged when Fallout shipped on the 30th of September 1997 was something the RPG genre hadn't quite seen before. An open world with genuine moral ambiguity, a visual style completely its own, a tone that moved fluently between darkly funny and genuinely tragic, and a system of player choice that actually respected the choices it offered. Critics responded with significant enthusiasm. Players responded by playing it for hundreds of hours and talking about it for decades afterward. Tim Kaine wrote the game's opening monologue, all of it. He's said in various interviews that he was the only writer on the project at the time he wrote it, and that it was his only writing contribution to the game beyond that. Those words, war never changes, became perhaps the most recognizable opening lines in the history of video games. They were written by the programmer who was also somehow managing the project, who was waking up at 6 in the morning and shopping for groceries at 2 in the morning to fit them around his schedule, who was paying his mortgage by renting out a room to a production assistant. In the Fallout 2 game files, in a cemetery near the town of New Reno, there is a gravestone that reads, Tim Kaine, founder, lover, fighter, programmer. It's an Easter egg left by the sequel's team, a small monument to the man who started all of it. Tim Kaine's face is also the game icon that appears when you display Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 at larger than 32 by 32 pixels. And if you type the word boom on the credits screen, you get to watch an animation of his head exploding. This is apparently something he found genuinely amusing. After the first Fallout shipped, Kaine left Interplay. The crunch had been immense. A memory overwrite bug near the end of development had delayed the game and resulted in months of exhausting additional work, and the company environment had become difficult for reasons both professional and personal. He went on to co-found Troika Games, where he made Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura and Vampire: The Masquerade Bloodlines, both of which have their own passionate followings. He eventually rejoined Obsidian Entertainment, where he co-directed The Outer Worlds, and as of 2026, he's back at Obsidian full-time, working on something under NDA that he promises is not what anyone is expecting. The franchise he left behind had a complicated road ahead of it, but the foundation was solid enough to survive everything that was about to happen. Wherever you're listening from right now, drop it in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment. There's a lot more Wasteland ahead. Part 2. War. War never changes. The alternate history and pre-war world. The genius of Fallout's setting isn't the nuclear war. It's the world that existed before it. Most post-apocalyptic stories start with a disaster and work backward, hinting at a civilization that felt more or less like ours. Fallout takes a different approach. It builds a complete, coherent, alternate history and then demolishes it, and the demolition hits harder because the world being destroyed is strange and vibrant and fully realized in its own right. The Fallout timeline diverges from ours after World War II. In our history, the post-war decades brought the transistor revolution, the silicon chip, the personal computer, the internet, the miniaturization of technology into forms that would have looked like science fiction to someone in 1950. In the Fallout timeline, none of that happened. Technology advanced in a different direction entirely, with nuclear fission becoming the dominant power source for everything, from cars to household appliances. The transistor existed in the Fallout world, but it never sparked the digital revolution. Computers remained enormous and room-filling, running on vacuum tubes. Data storage happened on holodisks rather than hard drives. The cultural aesthetic of the 1950s, the optimism, the chrome, the family dinners, and the patriotism and the certainty of progress, simply never got replaced by the counterculture movements and the technological disruptions that reshaped our world in the 1960s and beyond. What you get from this is a world that looks simultaneously more advanced and less advanced than ours. A Fallout citizen in 2077 has access to robots that can think and speak and perform complex tasks. They can buy Nuka-Cola from a vending machine powered by a compact fusion cell. Their car runs on nuclear energy and produces essentially no exhaust. But they also live in a world that still looks and feels architecturally and culturally like it's 60 years earlier. The advertisements are cheerful and mid-century. The radio plays big band and swing. The suburban ideal of the nuclear family has not been challenged in any meaningful way. The government is an amplified version of 1950s American nationalism, proud and paranoid in equal measure. This creates a specific kind of horror. The Fallout world isn't a dystopia in the way we usually mean the word. It's not obviously authoritarian or obviously broken. It looks, on the surface, like a success. The propaganda works because the propaganda is sincere. The people who made the advertisements and the public service announcements and the cheerful government messaging genuinely believed in what they were selling. They thought fusion power had solved the energy problem. They thought American ingenuity and American values would carry humanity through anything. They were wrong in ways they couldn't see coming. The resource wars began in 2052. As the world's oil reserves dwindled, conflict broke out across multiple continents. The Middle East, Europe, and Asia all became theaters of a slow, grinding struggle over the remaining fossil fuels. The United Nations attempted to intervene and failed, eventually dissolving entirely. The European Commonwealth fell apart into internal conflict. China and the United States emerged as the two dominant global powers, and they were pointed directly at each other. The Sino-American War is the central geopolitical catastrophe of the Fallout world's final decades. American forces occupied Alaska to protect critical oil pipeline infrastructure. China invaded Alaska in 2066, and the resulting Battle of Anchorage became one of the defining military engagements of the era, eventually ending with a costly American victory in 2077. American forces crossed the Canadian border as well, annexing Canada as the 51st state in the face of significant Canadian resistance, including acts of sabotage on the oil pipeline that the American government couldn't tolerate. The war burned on. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides developed more terrible weapons. The forced evolutionary virus, which we'll discuss in much more detail later, was originally a government research project aimed at protecting soldiers and finding cures for new diseases. It was weaponized. Power armor, the iconic suit of mechanical infantry gear that has appeared in every Fallout game since the first, was developed during this period. The T-45 model was the first to see field deployment during the Anchorage campaign, making American infantry effectively into walking tanks. None of this was secret within the Fallout world. The citizens knew there was a war. They saw the news. They bought war bonds. They supported their troops with the same earnest patriotism that the 1950s aesthetic had trained them into. But they were also being lied to in systematic and comprehensive ways. The government knew the war might end in nuclear exchange. They knew the vaults weren't just emergency shelters. They had plans. The Great War arrived on the 23rd of October, 2077. Nobody in the Fallout world is entirely sure who fired first. The exchange happened fast, within a matter of hours, the way nuclear war has always threatened to happen. Missiles and bombs fell across the United States, China, and presumably other targets around the world. 2 hours of fire, that was enough. The civilization of 2077, with all its fusion cars and Protectron robots and cheerful Nuka-Cola marketing, ceased to exist. What remained was the wasteland. The scale of the cultural world-building that Fallout's creators poured into the pre-war setting is extraordinary when you consider that most players spend very little time in it directly. Pre-war America exists primarily as ruins, as terminal entries, as propaganda posters peeling off of crumbling walls, as holotapes left by people who are now 2 centuries dead. You understand it through its aftermath. But the care taken in constructing it means that those ruins feel real in a way that most game environments don't quite achieve. The Nuka-Cola plant in Fallout 3 feels like a real factory because someone thought very carefully about how a 1950s aesthetic soda company would have operated. The suburban neighborhoods of the Commonwealth in Fallout 4 feel like real neighborhoods because the team considered what 2077 domestic life would have looked like down to the cereal boxes on the kitchen shelves. The detail that gets people is often the mundane stuff. A pre-war journal from someone worried about their kids' grades. A terminal entry from a warehouse manager dealing with a supply chain problem. A radio broadcast from a baseball game that was interrupted by the emergency alert. These fragments don't advance any plot. They just exist, quietly, in the ruins of a world that was full of ordinary people living ordinary lives until it wasn't. The wasteland radio stations in the games do something clever with the pre-war music. Stations like Fallout 3's Galaxy News Radio or New Vegas's radio. New Vegas play music from the 1940s and 1950s, which is the contemporary music of the pre-war world that survived into the post-war era. Songs like Butcher Pete, Anything Goes, and A Kiss to Build a Dream On are not nostalgic in the Fallout world the way they are for us. They're recent, they're from the world that just burned. Hearing them playing over the ruins carries a specific melancholy that the games lean into deliberately. One of the most quietly devastating details in the entire franchise is the Ink Spot song I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire, which plays over the opening of Fallout 3. The song is about love, about wanting to be with someone so badly that you'd trade away global ambitions just to hold a flame in their heart. Applied to a world that has in fact set itself on fire, it becomes something that can stop a player in their tracks. The games were very deliberate about this kind of tonal layering. The music that survived the apocalypse is full of songs about love and hope and the future, playing over a world where the future arrived and it was terrible. The Nuka-Cola Corporation deserves a paragraph of its own because it's one of the richest pieces of world-building in the series. Nuka-Cola was the most popular soft drink in pre-war America, produced in a dozen or more varieties, marketed with an energy and enthusiasm that feels almost parodic until you remember that this was exactly how American consumer culture operated in the mid-23rd century. The company had theme parks, it had mascots, it had promotional tie-ins with the military. It had Nuka-Cola Quantum, a special variety with a faint blue glow from a small amount of radioactive strontium added to the formula for the aesthetic, which says everything you need to know about the Fallout world's relationship with nuclear technology. After the war, bottles of Nuka-Cola became a de facto currency alongside bottle caps. The apocalypse came and went, and people were still drinking the same soda they'd always drunk because you could still find the bottles, and the formula was stable enough to survive 2 centuries in a cooler. Robco Industries produced the Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted computer that player characters use in every modern Fallout game to track quests, manage inventory, and navigate the map. In the pre-war world, Pip-Boys were issued to Vault-Tec residents as personal information management devices. They're powered by their own atomic battery, essentially indestructible by normal standards, and designed to interface with the Vault's infrastructure. The fact that they're still functional 200 years after the apocalypse says something both about the quality of 2077 manufacturing and about the specific durability that nuclear-powered electronics would have over our fragile digital devices. The lore of the pre-war world rewards careful reading in a way that most game fiction doesn't. The terminal entries and holotapes scattered across the wastelands form a kind of fragmentary archive of a civilization's final years, and the more of it you read, the more you understand both how it happened and how it could have been prevented. The people of pre-war America weren't villains. They were people living in a system that had been optimized for consumption, patriotism, and the suppression of uncomfortable truths, and they never quite saw the edge they were walking toward. That tension between the charming surface of the Fallout world and the horror underneath it is what gives the franchise its lasting power. You're not just exploring a wasteland, you're exploring the ruins of a warning. Part 3. The Vaults Were Never Safe. Vault-Tec and Its Experiments. Let's talk about what Vault-Tec actually built. The official story, the one that the citizens of pre-war America were told, was straightforward. Vault-Tec Corporation won a government contract to build an enormous network of underground shelters, capable of housing hundreds of thousands of people, designed to protect American civilians and ensure the continuity of civilization in the event of nuclear war. The vaults were sold as the ultimate expression of American optimism and preparedness. Buy your spot, secure your family's future, Vault-Tec's got you covered. The reality was different in ways that are difficult to fully absorb even after you know them. The vaults were not primarily built to save anyone. They were built as laboratories. Each vault, with a handful of exceptions, was designed to conduct a specific experiment on its population, using the dwellers as test subjects without their knowledge or consent. The results of these experiments were intended to inform post-war planning, providing data on human behavior under stress, on biological modifications, on social structures, on the limits of what human beings would tolerate and when they would break. Vault-Tec knew the war was coming. The US government knew the war was coming. They commissioned the experiments because they wanted a head start on understanding how to manage and rebuild society after the catastrophe they could see approaching on the horizon. The vaults were less of a shelter system and more of a controlled trial run for post-apocalyptic civilization, with the American public as the unwitting participants. This information is revealed across multiple games and fragments, through terminal entries and holotapes and conversations with characters who've pieced together the truth. Putting it all together creates one of the darkest pictures in any major video game franchise. The scale of the vault system was enormous. The Fallout games have introduced dozens of individual vaults, each with its own designated experiment, and the wiki documents more than 120 known vaults, though not all of them are accessible in the games. The experiments ranged from the merely strange to the genuinely monstrous, and examining them individually gives a sense of just how comprehensively Vault-Tec thought about this project. Vault 12, in the ruins of Necropolis, was designed with a deliberate flaw. The door was engineered not to seal correctly, ensuring that radiation from the outside world would slowly leak in. The population was exposed to increasing levels of radiation over years, and the experiment was to observe the effects of gradual radiation exposure on human beings. Most of the population died, some of them ghoulified, their bodies transforming through radiation into the long-lived, radiation-resistant, perpetually decaying creatures that Fallout calls ghouls. The survivors of Vault 12, including a man who would eventually become the self-styled king of Necropolis, had been subjected to this without ever being told what was happening to them. Vault 77, which exists primarily in a promotional penny arcade comic rather than directly in the games but is canonized through a reference in Fallout 3, contained a single human being and a crate of puppets. One man, alone in a vault with only hand puppets for company, for years? The penny arcade comic follows this man's slow psychological unraveling and eventual emergence into the wasteland, as someone deeply changed by the experience, eventually becoming a legendary figure who the slavers in Paradise Falls are warned about by name. A Vault 77 jumpsuit appears in Fallout 3 at the Paradise Falls camp, accompanied by a note urging whoever found it to burn it. The Puppet Man, the holotape says. That's what they're calling him. Vault 81 in Fallout 4's Commonwealth was designed with a secondary purpose hidden from its own population. The vault was equipped with a system of observation rooms and had a fully functional lab section that the residents never knew about, staffed by a team of scientists who were supposed to run experiments exposing the vault's animals and people to various diseases and then testing potential cures on them. The intended purpose was to find a universal cure for human illness, using the vault's dwellers as test subjects. The scientist responsible for actually running the experiments sabotaged the effort because he couldn't bring himself to go through with it. He rerouted all the experimental substances through the animal population rather than the human one. As a result, Vault 81 is one of the few vaults where the experiment effectively failed in a way that actually helped the residents, though one disease from the animal experiments does escape into the vault at some point in the backstory, leading to the questline players encounter there. Hidden somewhere in Vault 81's depths is a single mole rat that carries a cure for the disease that same vault accidentally created. Vault 87 was the production site for the forced evolutionary virus experiments in the Capital Wasteland. The experiment was explicit and brutal. Expose the population to FEV and document the transformation. Residents of Vault 87 became super mutants. The facility in Fallout 3 is one of the most irradiated locations in the game, pumped full of radiation that makes direct approach nearly impossible without extensive preparation, and the super mutants that haunt the region around it are direct descendants of what Vault-Tec did there. Vault 92 was populated almost exclusively with renowned musicians. White noise experiments were conducted on the residents through speakers in their quarters, experiments that the Vault's own documentation describes as testing the effects on human performance and stress tolerance. The actual result was that the white noise triggered violent episodes in the dwellers. The Vault descended into a series of outbreaks of violence that eventually left everyone dead, and the player finds it as a ruin of a place that was once filled with talented people who were murdered by the sound designed to manipulate their minds. Vault 101. In Fallout 3 is the vault that the player character grows up in, and its experiment has a particular cruelty to it. The experiment was that the vault would never open, not ever. Other vaults were designed with eventual emergence in mind. A signal from Vault-Tec or the appropriate authority that would unlock the doors and send the dwellers out into the world. Vault 101 was designed to remain sealed indefinitely, its population meant to live and die within its walls across generations, testing what society looked like when there was literally no outside world. The Overseer's authority in Vault 101 was absolute by design, because without the possibility of leaving, the only stabilizing structure was the Overseer's word. But there was a second layer to the experiment, one that only a few knew. The actual test was to examine the role of the Overseer in a society with no exit, and what that role did to the person holding it. Vault 108 hosted one of the simplest and most disturbing experiments. The only Overseer cloning tube in the facility was a cloning device set to reproduce a single resident, a man named Gary. Gary was cloned over and over again, and each successive clone emerged more aggressive and less stable than the last. By the time a player reaches Vault 108 in Fallout 3, the vault has been entirely taken over by Gary clones, dozens of identical aggressive men who chase you through the corridors, shouting their own name. The original experiment had been to study whether a person's personality and capabilities could be maintained through cloning. The answer, in Gary's case, was a qualified and terrible no. Vault 11 from Fallout, New Vegas may be the single most disturbing of all documented vault experiments, and it's worth describing in some detail. The vault population was told that they had to sacrifice one member each year to Vault-Tec, or else the vault systems would be shut down and everyone would die. They were not told that this was a lie. They were not told that the sacrifice served no purpose and that the vault would continue functioning regardless of what they did. They were given an impossible moral situation and told to live inside it. The vault's population went through years of annual sacrifices, choosing who among them would die each year. Factions formed. Politics developed around the question of who would be given up. Eventually, after more than 50 years of this, 5 survivors from the vault rebelled and stormed the computer that was supposedly issuing the death orders. They prepared to destroy it rather than continue the sacrifices. At that moment, the computer announced to them that the sacrifice had never been necessary. The vault had always been designed to continue functioning. The experiment was to see what human society would do when given an impossible moral scenario with a fictional justification. The 5 survivors were then offered a reward: immunity from the outside world's influence, safety for themselves forever, in exchange for submitting to one final request. 4 of them accepted. The 5th refused. The 4 who accepted were then killed by the vault's automated systems because the final request was that they sacrifice themselves. The 5th walked out into the desert carrying the weight of everything that had happened in Vault 11, and the player finds the vault as a monument to 50 years of human beings doing terrible things to each other because they'd been told they had no other choice. Vault 95 in Fallout 4 was marketed as a rehabilitation facility for people struggling with chem addiction. The pitch was compassionate and the residents were people who genuinely needed help. The vault provided treatment, support structures, and a controlled environment. Once the dwellers had successfully completed rehabilitation and were clean, the vault introduced a hidden cache of drugs back into the environment to observe whether recovered addicts would relapse when temptation was reintroduced. The answer, predictably, was yes, and the vault fell apart in a wave of relapse and violence. Vault 75, in Fallout 4's Malden suburb, was built beneath an elementary school. The cover story was that children and their families could shelter there from nuclear war. The truth was that children would be admitted, and their parents would not. The children would then be raised and trained in a program designed to enhance human physical and mental potential, testing emerging adults for fitness, and eliminating those who didn't meet the experimental standards when they turned 18. Vault 75 was a breeding program for enhanced humans, disguised as a children's shelter. The cafeteria and classrooms and gymnasium equipment are still in place when players find it, which makes walking through it feel different from most of the game's locations. The scope of these experiments, and the knowledge that Vault Tech designed and implemented them with full awareness of what they were doing, is one of the central horrors of the Fallout universe. The bombs fall, the world burns, and the survivors who made it into the vaults thinking they were safe are discovered to have traded one kind of danger for another. Vault Tech didn't build shelters. It built a long series of controlled environments for studying what human beings do when they have no control. What makes this even darker, in the context of the broader lore, is the suggestion that the experiment didn't end with the vaults. The surface world was the next stage. The vaults were rehearsals. What came after, the factions and the societies and the power struggles of the wasteland, was the real experiment playing out at scale. Part 4. Creatures of the Wasteland. The origins of what lives out there. The wasteland is not empty. 200 years after the bombs fell, the irradiated world has filled itself with life that didn't exist before, life that shouldn't exist, life that was in some cases deliberately designed, and in other cases arrived at through paths of mutation that even Fallout scientists find difficult to fully explain. Understanding where the creatures come from changes how you look at them when you encounter them in the games. Let's start with the Deathclaw, because it's the most iconic of Fallout's post-apocalyptic fauna, and because its origin is more complicated than most players realize. The Deathclaw has the visual appearance of a massive reptilian predator, bipedal, somewhere between 8 and 10 feet tall when fully grown, with armor-dense scales, powerful hind legs, and the 2 enormous forward-curving claws that give it its name. It moves with a speed that is deeply counterintuitive for an animal that size. It is, in the games, one of the most dangerous things you can encounter in the open wasteland, and its presence in an area functions as an effective warning that the game is issuing about what the designers expect your level to be. The origin of the Deathclaw, according to the lore established in the Fallout 2 strategy guide and referenced through subsequent games, is not radiation. The Deathclaw was created deliberately. The U.S. military developed it as a biological weapon, a creature that could be used in high-risk combat situations to replace human soldiers in search and destroy operations. The base genetic material was Jackson's chameleon, a small and otherwise unremarkable lizard species notable primarily for its camouflage ability. Genetic manipulation and the forced evolutionary virus were applied to this material over many iterations, producing something almost unrecognizable from the starting point. The chameleon's capacity for color change survived in some Deathclaw variants. The rest of the chameleon did not. The original concept art for the Deathclaw, designed by Scott Campbell, showed a furry mammalian creature built from wolverine and brown bear genetic material rather than lizard. The reason the design shifted to the reptilian version that appears in the games has nothing to do with story or aesthetics. The rendering software of the time simply could not make fur move convincingly. Technical limitations turned the Deathclaw from a furry mammalian predator into a scaly reptilian one. An unused 3D model from a different project, initially sculpted for a Dungeons & Dragons game called Planescape that it was never used in, was repurposed into the Deathclaw's visual form. The D&D monster it resembled was the Tarrasque, which is one of the most legendary creatures in that game's bestiary. The Deathclaw started its life as a failed D&D monster that got resurrected and given a new home in a video game about nuclear war. After the Great War, Deathclaws escaped into the wild and began breeding naturally. The FEV they'd been modified with continued to work on their genetics over generations, and some populations developed enhanced intelligence on top of their already formidable physical capabilities. The intelligent Deathclaws of Fallout 2 can speak, reason, form social structures, and articulate emotions and goals. They know they were created to be weapons. They know what was done to them. There's a particular Deathclaw in Fallout 2 named Gorus, who wears a hooded robe and serves as a companion, and he's one of the more interesting NPCs in the series precisely because of what he represents. A being who was designed as a monster, who has become something more, who has to exist in a world that will never stop seeing only the monster. Super mutants have a different origin, more consistent across the series, though the Fallout games have introduced regional variations with their own specific histories. The baseline origin of all super mutants is the forced evolutionary virus, a compound developed originally as a potential cure for the new plague, a mysterious disease that emerged in the 2050s and killed tens of thousands of people. The FEV was developed by the government at the Mariposa military base in California, and its initial purpose was medical rather than military. It was effective at protecting people from certain diseases, but the side effects were dramatically transformative. Exposure to FEV caused massive cellular changes, accelerating growth and dramatically increasing physical capability, while simultaneously causing significant neurological damage in most subjects, reducing intelligence and altering personality. The Mariposa facility began conducting FEV experiments on human subjects without consent, using prisoners and other convenient populations. The subjects who survived became the first super mutants, enormous, physically powerful, cognitively impaired beings with green-gray skin and an instinct toward aggression. The Master, the primary antagonist of the original Fallout, was a man who fell into a vat of FEV at Mariposa and was transformed over time into a grotesque collective organism, merging with technology and other beings into something that could think across multiple consciousness simultaneously. His plan was to convert all of humanity to super mutants, which he genuinely believed would be an improvement on their fragile, war-prone baseline state. He was wrong, though the specific reason he was wrong, which the player can discover and present to him in the game's climax, is one of the most elegantly designed revelations in the original game. Ghouls are the third major type of transformed human in the Fallout world, and their origin is both simpler and stranger than that of the mutants. Ghoulification is the term for what happens to a human being who is exposed to the right combination of radiation and specific cellular properties. Most people who receive enough radiation simply die from radiation sickness. Some people, for reasons that aren't entirely understood in the lore, undergo a different process. Their skin begins to decay and corrupted-looking even as they remain alive. Their lifespan extends dramatically, in many cases effectively indefinitely. They become immune to radiation and are in fact healed by it in some circumstances. Their fertility is eliminated. Their mental faculties can remain fully intact, or they can gradually deteriorate over centuries into feral states where complex thought is no longer possible. The existence of ghouls creates a category of character in the Fallout world that is deeply unusual in fiction. People who remember the pre-war world because they actually lived in it. A ghoul encountered in Fallout 4's Commonwealth might have been born in 1950, might have watched the bombs fall as an adult, might have spent the next 200 years watching humanity rebuild and fall apart and rebuild again. The ghoul companion in the Amazon television series, played by Walton Goggins, is a character named Cooper Howard who was a pre-war actor, a man from the 1950s who has survived into the 23rd century by gradually becoming something other than what he was. What the show does with his interiority, The weight of that many years, the cost of survival in a world determined to kill you, is one of its most successful creative choices. The feral ghoul degeneration is a subject of ongoing debate in Fallout's in-world lore. How long does it take? What triggers it? Can it be reversed? Different sources across the games give different answers, suggesting that the process isn't uniform, and that environmental factors, psychological factors, and individual biological variation all play a role. What's consistent is the picture it creates. Some ghouls spend centuries intact, maintaining their personalities and memories and moral frameworks, while others lose themselves over time, becoming the mindless, aggressive creatures you find in ruins across the wasteland. The possibility of that eventual deterioration hangs over every long-lived ghoul character in the series, an existential threat from within. Mirelurks deserve a mention because they're one of the Fallout creature types with the most interesting pre-war connections. Mirelurks are heavily mutated crustaceans, their basic form resembling an enormous crab walking upright, with hard, shell-like carapace covering most of their body, and a disturbing face that looks almost anthropoid when you see it directly. The Mirelurk species is one of the few examples of a creature that shows clear signs of radiation exposure, affecting it even before the Great War. Evidence in various games suggests that chemical pollution from pre-war industry was already beginning to alter the crab populations along major waterways before the bombs ever fell. What the bombs did was accelerate and complete a process that had already begun. The rad scorpion, which is exactly what it sounds like, began as a standard North American emperor scorpion. Exposure to radiation over generations produced something dramatically larger, considerably more aggressive, and considerably more venomous. The game mechanics of rad scorpion encounters, particularly the poison they inflict, are a direct expression of the lore. These are animals that evolved under pressure to be better at killing things, and they got very good at it. The bloatfly is a source of dark humor in the games. It was originally a common fly that has been transformed by radiation into something larger and genuinely dangerous, capable of launching small projectiles from its abdomen in a biological process that the game never quite explains. The fact that the wasteland's most mundane pest turned into something capable of spitting larvae at you as a defense mechanism says something about the thoroughness with which the Fallout world was transformed. The Yao Guai are mutated black bears, recognizable in their general shape, but rendered substantially more dangerous than any bear you'd encounter in our world. Their name comes from a Chinese term for demon or monster, which is a detail specific to Fallout 3 and a reminder that the Sino-American War's influence extended even to how survivors named the things around them. What's consistent across all of these creatures is that they connect the present wasteland to the pre-war world in ways that are always meaningful. Every monster in Fallout is, in some sense, a legacy, a consequence, something that the world before the bombs set in motion, either through deliberate design or careless pollution, or the simple accident of nuclear fire falling on a living ecosystem. The wasteland is full of things that shouldn't be there, and every one of them is there because of choices that people made before the war. That's not an accident of the fiction. It's the point. Part 5. The Capital Wasteland's Secrets Behind Fallout 3. Fallout 3 is where millions of people first entered the post-apocalyptic wasteland, and it remains one of the most significant games in the franchise's history, precisely because of the scale of what Bethesda attempted with it. Taking an isometric turn-based RPG and reimagining it as a first-person open-world game was not a guaranteed success. It required not just technical capability but a fundamental rethinking of how the Fallout experience should feel in 3 dimensions, how the atmosphere should be built when the camera was positioned behind the player's eyes rather than floating above them, how a world that had always been communicated through a top-down perspective could be translated into something you could walk through and feel around you. Bethesda had purchased the Fallout intellectual property from Interplay in 2004. The deal was structured in stages. Bethesda initially licensed the rights to make a single Fallout game, with the option to purchase the full IP outright, which they exercised in 2007. The studio behind the Elder Scrolls series brought its own considerable strengths to the project. They knew how to build vast open worlds. They knew how to fill those worlds with environmental storytelling. They knew how to make exploration feel consistently rewarding. The development of Fallout 3 used the Gamebryo engine, the same engine that powered Oblivion, and the parallels between the two games' structural approaches are visible if you look for them. Both feature an opening sequence set in a confined tutorial environment before releasing you into an enormous open world. Both use a primary quest that drives the narrative while leaving enormous room for digression. Both are designed to reward players who wander off the main road and investigate what's around the next corner. The Capital Wasteland, the game's setting in the ruins of Washington, D.C. and its surrounding suburbs, is one of the most evocative settings in the series. The decision to base the game in the ruins of actual American political geography was deliberate and meaningful. The Washington Monument stands in the wasteland. The Jefferson Memorial becomes the site of Project Purity. The Lincoln Memorial has been taken over by freed slaves calling themselves the Regulator Gang. The Library of Congress is there. The Mall is there, a stretch of ruined museums and government buildings that in the old world was the symbolic center of American democracy and is now a contested battlefield between the Brotherhood of Steel and the super mutant armies. There's a detail in Fallout 3 that most players walk past without noticing. A road sign in the environment that reads TES-4. It's a reference to The Elder Scrolls 4. Oblivion, a small internal joke from the development team acknowledging the engine they shared. The game is full of this kind of quiet self-reference. In the Chevy Chase area of the Capital Wasteland, there's a monument to Interplay, the publisher of the original Fallout games, rendered as a version of Interplay's actual corporate logo, a globe circled by a small rocket. It's a tribute to the company that started everything and a reminder that Bethesda was well aware of the franchise's history. Point Lookout, the DLC set in a flooded coastal area, contains references to Isla Negra Holdings, which is Spanish for Black Isle, the studio that made the original games. The game's cut content reveals a version of Fallout 3 that was both more and less than what shipped. A stealth indicator that was removed from the final version had worked as a circle that grew and shrank based on how hidden you were, a more nuanced system than the text-based hidden, caution, danger indicator that replaced it. An alternate pathway through the main quest's late stages was built and then cut. A set of unused wasteland rocks, visible in early screenshots, were judged as too smooth and organic-looking by lead artist Istvan Pelli, who felt they needed to be more angular and rough before they'd feel right in the Capital Wasteland. The cave rocks in the shipped game still use those early meshes as a structural base, just dressed in darker, more angular textures. Vault 77, the one-man vault with the crate of puppets, exists in Fallout 3 only as a reference through the Vault 77 jumpsuit found at Paradise Falls. But the impact of that reference on the kind of community Fallout's fanbase had become was significant. The Penny Arcade comic that established Vault 77's story was written by Jerry Holkins, who writes under the name Tycho, and it played the absurdity of the premise completely straight. One man. A vault full of supplies and furniture and utilities designed for hundreds and puppets. The comic's central figure goes through stages of adaptation and denial and eventual strange acceptance. And when he finally emerges from the vault, he's carrying the puppets, and he's carrying something harder to name. Vault 112 is another Fallout 3 location that rewards extended attention. The vault is operational in a very specific sense. It's running a virtual reality simulation called Tranquility Lane, designed and administered by a Vault-Tec scientist named Stanislaus Braun, who has kept the Vault's residents in a simulated 1950s American suburb for the past 200 years. The residents in the simulation don't know it's a simulation. They're living normal suburban lives, growing old and dying and being reset by the simulation, and living normal suburban lives again, over and over, while their physical bodies lie in pods in the actual vault below. Braun himself, running the simulation from within it as a little girl named Betty, has grown bored over 2 centuries of this and has begun adding cruelty to the scenario for his own amusement. When the player enters the simulation looking for their father, they discover a suburb full of people who have been trapped in a pleasant-looking nightmare for 200 years. The Lincoln Memorial questline in Fallout 3 is one of the game's more politically earnest decisions. The memorial has been taken over by a group called the Slavers from Paradise Falls, who have displaced the former residents. A freed slave named Hannibal Hamlin, who shares his name with Abraham Lincoln's vice president, has a group of escaped slaves trying to reclaim it. The game lets you choose sides or find a middle path, but the symbolic weight of a game set in the ruins of American democracy staging a fight over Abraham Lincoln's memorial involving slavery and freedom is not accidental. Bethesda wanted the game to engage with the history of its setting, and this is one of the places where that engagement is most direct. The Enclave, the remnant of the pre-war American federal government, serves as the game's primary antagonist faction, and their specific villainy in Fallout 3, their plan to purify the wasteland's water supply with a modified virus that would kill anyone with detectable mutation, which is essentially everyone in the wasteland, given 2 centuries of radiation exposure, is an idea the game takes seriously. The Enclave believes they are the legitimate heirs of America and that their plan is restoration rather than genocide. President Eden, their AI president, is charming and folksy and absolutely committed to wiping out most of the human population. It's a combination that the game doesn't play entirely for irony. Eden's reasoning is internally consistent in the way that the reasoning of the truly deluded can be, and the game lets you engage with it. The Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 3 is significantly different from the Brotherhood as established in the first 2 games. In the California set originals, the Brotherhood was a secretive, isolationist organization obsessed with preserving pre-war technology, deeply reluctant to share it or to actively engage with the broader wasteland's problems. By the time of Fallout 3's DC setting, the East Coast chapter of the Brotherhood has evolved into something more actively heroic, fighting super mutants, protecting civilians, and positioning themselves explicitly as defenders of humanity. This shift was controversial among fans of the original games, who felt it softened the Brotherhood's more complicated characterization in ways that made them too straightforwardly good. The conversation about what the Brotherhood is and should be has continued through every subsequent game. There's a moment in Fallout 3 that a specific kind of player finds on their first playthrough and never forgets. It's not a big set piece or a major story beat. It's a house in the suburbs of the capital wasteland, with a skeleton in a rocking chair on the front porch and a terminal inside that contains a series of diary entries from someone who watched the bombs fall, decided not to go into a shelter, made themselves as comfortable as they could in their home, and waited to die. The entries are quiet and specific, about what they ate, what they thought about, what they were looking at when they decided they'd said everything they needed to say. This kind of environmental storytelling, a story told entirely through objects and text with no NPC and no quest marker attached to it, is one of the things that Bethesda's open-world design does particularly well, and Fallout 3 is full of moments like it. The Rivet City questline involving the android Zimmer and the escaped synthetic human Harkness plants seeds for the Institute, and the synthetic human storyline that Fallout 4 would later develop at length. It's a small story in Fallout 3's terms, a side quest that most players could miss entirely, but it introduces the idea that scientific organizations in the post-war world are capable of creating artificial beings indistinguishable from humans, and raises the question of whether such beings are property or people. That question, deferred for years, became the central moral architecture of Fallout 4. Part 6. 18 months in the Mojave, the making of New Vegas. At some point in early 2009, Bethesda reached out to Obsidian Entertainment with a proposition that was either an extraordinary opportunity or an extremely difficult test, depending on how you looked at it. The success of Fallout 3 had established that the franchise could work in 3 dimensions and that there was an enormous audience for it. Bethesda's internal team was already committed to The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, which would require years of focused effort. But maintaining momentum on the Fallout brand, keeping it present in the market while Skyrim was being built, was commercially valuable. The solution was to contract with an external developer to make a new Fallout game, a spin-off that would use Fallout 3's engine and much of its asset library, set in a new region with a new story. Obsidian Entertainment was the natural choice, because Obsidian's founders were many of the same people who had made the original Fallout games at Black Isle Studios. Fergus Urquhart, who had led Black Isle, was one of Obsidian's co-founders. Josh Sawyer, who had worked on Van Buren, the cancelled Black Isle Fallout 3, would serve as Fallout, New Vegas's director. The creative team at Obsidian had a genuine relationship with the Fallout franchise that went back to its beginning. They weren't inheriting someone else's universe. They were coming home. The timeline they were given was 18 months. For context, Bethesda's Fallout 3 had been in development for several years. New Vegas was expected to be a full, ambitious role-playing game with a new map, a new story, new factions, new characters, new companions, new mechanics, and new dialogue on a scale that matched or exceeded its predecessor. It was expected to use a game engine that Obsidian hadn't previously worked with, the Gamebryo engine that Bethesda had used for their own games. And it was expected to be finished in 18 months from the beginning of development to a shippable product. This was, by the standards of the industry even then, an extremely compressed schedule. Josh Sawyer has discussed it in various interviews over the years, with the particular tone of someone describing something that was genuinely difficult, but that they're not entirely sure they'd change. The result of those 18 months is a game that many players and critics consider the best in the Fallout franchise. Fallout: New Vegas is set in the Mojave Wasteland, centered on the ruins of Las Vegas, which in the Fallout universe survived the bombs primarily because the city's pre-war ruler, the enigmatic and ancient Robert House, had the foresight, the resources, and the technical capability to shoot down most of the incoming missiles before they arrived. New Vegas stands in the middle of the wasteland as something unprecedented, a city that actually functions, that has electricity and running water and economic activity and a measure of safety within its walls. The Strip, the rebuilt casino district, is operational, and visitors come from across the Mojave to gamble and drink and enjoy a version of civilization that doesn't exist anywhere else. The political situation of the Mojave is built around a three-way conflict between the new California Republic, the largest democratic state in the post-war West, which has been expanding eastward and now controls significant territory including the Hoover Dam. Caesar's Legion, a brutal slaveholding empire built by a pre-war sociologist named Edward Sallow, who renamed himself Caesar and used his knowledge of Roman history to construct a militarized society that had conquered much of the American Southwest, and Mr. House, the eccentric pre-war billionaire who runs New Vegas through an army of Securitrons and robotic casino staff and who has his own vision for what the Mojave should become. The player character, a courier who was shot in the head and left for dead in the opening minutes, arrives at this conflict from outside, without the institutional loyalties or the tribal commitments of the major factions. The game's design explicitly builds on this. You can ally with any faction. You can try to play them against each other. You can pursue the option of taking the Mojave for yourself or for no one at all. The reputation system, which tracks your standing with dozens of factions and communities across the Mojave, is more nuanced than anything in Fallout 3, and creates a sense that the world is watching and responding to what you do in ways that matter. Josh Sawyer has spoken about his approach to New Vegas as drawing fundamentally on the philosophy of the original Fallout. He cared about giving players genuine choices with genuine consequences, about respecting the player's intelligence, about building a world where the factions had internally consistent beliefs and motivations rather than existing as props for the player to push around. Caesar's Legion is a good example of this. The Legion is, within the game, genuinely brutal and genuinely cruel, in ways the game doesn't shy away from. They practice slavery. They crucify enemies along roadsides. They have rigid gender roles that leave women in diminished positions. But the game also takes seriously why someone might genuinely support the Legion. Stability, safety from raider attacks, infrastructure, a clear social order in a world where social order is rare. The characters who support the Legion do so for reasons that are understandable even when the thing they're supporting is not. The game's companions are another area where New Vegas particularly excels. Companions in Fallout 3 were well designed in terms of their gameplay utility, but their personality and their integration into the story were relatively limited. New Vegas's companions, Boone the haunted sniper, Arcade Gannon the idealistic doctor with secrets, Raoul the centuries-old ghoul who was once a mechanic and now is something harder to categorize, Veronica the Brotherhood of Steel scribe who is quietly at war with her own organization's values, are all richly developed characters whose own questlines illuminate the game's themes. They also react to the world differently based on your choices and their own histories, which makes traveling with them feel like traveling with people rather than with useful assets. The Metacritic bonus story is one of the most discussed behind-the-scenes moments in the game's history. Bethesda's contract with Obsidian included a bonus payment tied to the game's Metacritic score. If the game achieved a score of 85 or above on the review aggregator, Obsidian would receive a bonus. Fallout: New Vegas shipped to significant acclaim. Players and critics loved it. On PC and Xbox 360, it scored an 84, 1 point below the threshold. The bonus was not paid. Chris Avallone, a writer who worked on the game and is one of the most influential figures in RPG writing history, discussed this on Twitter at some point, though he deleted the tweet after it was widely reported. The story became a kind of shorthand in conversations about publisher-developer relationships and the sometimes brutal economics of game development. Obsidian went on, and they made more acclaimed games. And Fallout New Vegas's reputation has, if anything, grown in the years since its release, but the Metacritic story has never quite stopped being a thing that comes up when people talk about how the industry treats developers. The game was also, at launch, quite buggy. The 18-month schedule hadn't allowed for the depth of QA testing that a project of this size warranted, and players encountered a significant number of glitches ranging from the cosmetic to the game-breaking. A development build found in a Utah game store years later, discovered in 2024 and documented by Hidden Palace, revealed development kits containing a beta version of New Vegas from about a month before the game went gold. The build shows a game that was still actively having content removed as late as that stage, cut for optimization and time constraints, content that was never seen in the final release. Memory dumps from the buggy development process contain textures, models, audio files, and dialogue that never made it into the shipped game. The scale of what was left on the cutting room floor gives some sense of how ambitious the original vision was. The game's 4 DLC expansions, Dead Money, Honest Hearts, Old World Blues, and Lonesome Road, are considered among the best DLC content in the series, and in some cases in the RPG genre broadly. Old World Blues in particular, set in the ruins of a pre-war research facility called the Big Mountain where disembodied brains and robots conduct increasingly absurd experiments, captures something about the Fallout universe's relationship between genuine darkness and pitch-black comedy that the mainline games sometimes struggle to balance. Dead Money, by contrast, is one of the grimmer Fallout experiences ever designed, a story about addiction and obsession and the things people are willing to do to hold on to what they love. Lonesome Road brings the player into direct conflict with the game's most elusive antagonist, Ulysses, and delivers the emotional conclusion to the courier's backstory. The final DLC content for New Vegas shipped just 2 months before Skyrim's November 2011 release, which is exactly the kind of scheduling that Bethesda had been managing for since they set New Vegas's development window. Skyrim sold enormously well. So eventually did New Vegas, even accounting for its bumpy launch. Part 7. Van Buren: The Fallout That Never Was. Before Bethesda's Fallout 3 existed, there was a different Fallout 3. It was being built at Black Isle Studios, the RPG division that Interplay had assembled in the late 1990s. The team responsible for Fallout 2 and Planescape, Torment, and the Baldur's Gate games. Its codename was Van Buren, following Black Isle's tradition of giving their projects presidential surnames during development. Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States. The project never came close to becoming a president or anything else. The story of Van Buren is the story of a company falling apart, of corporate decisions made by people who weren't paying attention, and of the specific, painful way that good creative work gets destroyed, not by failure but by neglect. Black Isle's Van Buren was significantly different from what Bethesda eventually built. It was planned as an isometric turn-based RPG, maintaining the core gameplay tradition of the first 2 Fallout games. It was running on a new proprietary 3D engine, still using an overhead perspective but with 3-dimensional graphics rather than the sprite-based visuals of the originals. The setting was the American Southwest, Colorado, and the surrounding regions. The player character would be an escaped prisoner, busted out of a facility called Tibbetts Prison by a mysterious event, and would be pursued by robotic prison guards across a world that had moved significantly on from the California-centric events of the first 2 games. The design documents for Van Buren were eventually leaked to a fan site called No Mutants Allowed in 2005 and 2006, and they've been extensively analyzed by the Fallout community in the years since. What they describe is a game of considerable ambition. The factions include a group called Caesar's Legion, which Josh Sawyer had designed for Van Buren and would later resurrect for New Vegas. The Followers of the Apocalypse, an organization from the original Fallout, would have featured prominently. New Vegas's Lucky 38 Casino has structural roots in Van Buren's concept of a mysterious tower in the middle of the wasteland. Even Joshua Graham, one of New Vegas's most beloved characters, the Burned Man, the former Malpais legate of Caesar's Legion who survived being set on fire and thrown into the Grand Canyon, was originally designed by Chris Avallone for Van Buren. The development team had run tabletop RPG campaigns to generate the setting's content. Designer J.E. Sawyer ran 2 separate games with Black Isle members, and the decisions those players made at the table directly inspired nearly all of Van Buren's location and character content. It was a development method that reflected the franchise's tabletop roots and produced content that had a specific kind of organic complexity to it. Then Interplay's financial situation deteriorated. The company had been struggling for years. A series of expensive projects and poor sales decisions had put them in a difficult position, and attempts to raise capital by going public had created a new set of tensions with the investment groups that came along with that process. Key figures, including founder Brian Fargo, left the company. The talent drain was significant and ongoing. Black Isle, which was housed in its own section of the Interplay building, found itself in an increasingly strange situation. They were a team of genuinely skilled developers working on a project they believed in, located 1 floor away from the Interplay executives who controlled their fate. Josh Sawyer has described how the Black Isle team repeatedly invited those executives to come up and see what they were building, to look at the progress on the Van Buren demo, to engage with the work. The executives declined, over and over again. They were busy. They had other things on their mind. They didn't come. In December 2003, Interplay shut down Black Isle entirely. The studio was closed, and the staff were let go. Van Buren was canceled in favor of Fallout, Brotherhood of Steel, a console action game that was significantly less ambitious and was not well received. The tech demo for Van Buren was eventually released in 2007, allowing fans to walk around a small portion of the game's world. Tom French, Van Buren's producer, finally showed the demo to the Interplay people who remained. According to Josh Sawyer, their response was, "Well, if we had known you had made this, maybe we wouldn't have canceled it." The Black Isle team had been 1 floor away. The executives had never come up. Some of the Black Isle developers, including Sawyer and Obsidian co-founder Fergus Urquhart, went on to form Obsidian Entertainment in 2003. The irony of the story is that Van Buren's most interesting ideas didn't die. They were carried forward by the people who developed them, and they surfaced years later in Fallout, New Vegas, Caesar's Legion, The Followers of the Apocalypse, Joshua Graham, the New California Republic as a complex, flawed, democratic state rather than a straightforward heroic entity. The thematic interest in what old-world philosophies and social structures people reach for when they're trying to rebuild civilization. Van Buren lives in the DNA of every Obsidian-developed game. It lives in New Vegas specifically, in ways that make New Vegas feel like both the game it is and a ghost of the game that never was. The name Van Buren also shows up on a map that appears in the Fallout television series' 2nd season. The ghoul, setting his course for Colorado, appears to be heading toward territory that was Van Buren's planned setting. Whether this is a conscious nod to the canceled game, the kind of thing that showrunners who've done their research would know about and want to include, or simply a coincidence of geography, the fan community has noticed and has opinions about it. Part 8. The Commonwealth's Hidden Depths Inside Fallout 4. Fallout 4 arrived in November 2015, 7 years after Fallout 3, and it was one of the most anticipated games in Bethesda's history. The wait had been long. The marketing had been effectively executed. The game shipped to enormous commercial success, selling over 12 million copies in its first 24 hours. The game is set in the Commonwealth, the post-apocalyptic ruins of Greater Boston, and it begins with something that no previous Fallout game had attempted, showing you the pre-war world directly. Not through terminal entries and photographs and ruins, but actually placing you in it. The game opens in 2077 in a picture-perfect suburban home in the minutes before the bombs fall. Your character, their spouse, their infant son Sean, their robot butler Codsworth, are gathered around the television watching the emergency broadcast when the missiles begin to arrive. You're rushing to the nearby Vault 111 when the camera pulls back and you see the city of Boston in the distance begin to burn. Then you wake up, in your cryogenic pod, 200 years later. Your spouse has been killed, your son has been taken, the world is unrecognizable, and you have to go find him. The personal stakes of Fallout 4's story, the missing child driving the main quest rather than the abstract or broadly political stakes of previous games, were a deliberate choice and a controversial one. Some players felt the personal emotional weight created a more engaging through line. Others felt it undermined the RPG freedom by making a specific emotional response feel obligatory. The debate about whether Fallout 4 is a good RPG or primarily a good action game with RPG elements has never fully resolved. What's less debated is the depth of Fallout 4's environmental storytelling, which is arguably the best in the franchise. The Commonwealth is full of small stories told entirely through placement and context, locations that don't have quest markers attached to them but that reward a player who stops and looks and reads. A hospital where the building's logs describe the chaos of the final hours before the bombs fell, doctors frantically treating patients who were brought in from areas hit by smaller tactical nukes in the early stages of the exchange. A comic book store whose owner had been reading issues alone when the war ended, who kept reading in the dark after the power went out, whose skeleton is still in the reading chair, an apartment building where the floors above a certain height are sealed off, and the terminals inside explain what happened to the people who lived there. These stories don't connect to quests. They just exist, adding weight to the world. The cut content of Fallout 4 is extensive and in some cases remarkable. A quest called 20 Leagues Under the Sea was sufficiently developed that it left evidence throughout the game's files. The quest would have taken the player to an underwater vault facility, and the Pip-Boy animation associated with it depicted a large creature moving through water. The files suggest that a giant squid was planned as one of the potential enemies in this underwater environment. Untextured assets for underwater vault windows and doors remain in the files, labeled in ways that make their intended purpose clear. The combat zone location in the game, a Raider-controlled arena in downtown Boston, was designed to be a functioning gladiatorial entertainment venue, where the player could enter combat as a fighter and win money. A character named Tommy serves as the combat zone's announcer, and his unused dialogue is still in the game's files, containing extensive commentary for fights that never happened. The combat zone that shipped is simply a Raider hideout with no arena mechanics, containing only its resident companion Kate and a bunch of enemies to kill. There was, at various points in development, a plan for a diving suit that would allow the player to explore underwater environments. Evidence for this includes not just the cut quest, but environmental details in the shipped game where clearly deliberate underwater features seem to exist without any way for the player to survive long enough to engage with them. Centaurs, the multi-limbed, mutated monsters that appear in Fallout 2 and Fallout 3 as enemies with a distinctive body horror aesthetic, were planned for Fallout 4. Concept art exists. Development steps were taken toward including them. They were ultimately not included in the final game, making Fallout 4 the only game in the series to omit them from its enemy roster, though no official explanation for their removal was given. The synths, the synthetic humans created by the institute that form the game's central mystery, are the descendants of the android question raised in Fallout 3's Rivet City questline. The institute has been producing increasingly sophisticated synthetic humans for decades by the time Fallout 4 begins, and the most recent generation, Generation 3 synths, are biologically human in every testable respect. They grow, they bleed, they experience something that functions like emotion and memory. Whether they are conscious, whether they are people with rights, or whether they are property that can be reclaimed and controlled, is the moral question at the center of the game. The Railroad, a secret organization dedicated to freeing synths and providing them with false memories and new identities, is directly modeled on the Underground Railroad of American history. The parallel is explicit, and the game doesn't try to be subtle about it. Their headquarters are hidden beneath the Freedom Trail, a real historical walking route through Boston's revolutionary history. The password to enter the Railroad's base is Railroad. They communicate through coded messages hidden along the trail itself. For a franchise that often engages with American history and mythology, the Railroad questline is one of its most direct and pointed engagements with the specific history of slavery and resistance. The Institute questline, approached from the other side, presents an organization that genuinely believes it's the best hope for humanity's future. Their leader in Fallout 4, and their general approach to the world above ground, reflect a kind of scientific contempt for the messiness of surface life. The Institute has clean halls and functioning technology and a vertical social structure organized around academic departments. What it lacks is any meaningful engagement with the people it affects. The synths it creates are tools. The surface world is a problem to be managed, not a community to be helped. Far Harbor, the DLC set on an island off the main coast, adds a layer to the synth question by introducing a community of synths who have created their own culture and belief system entirely apart from the Institute's influence. Acadia, the settlement where they live, is a place where synths who've escaped the Institute can try to figure out what they are and what they want to be. The philosophical depth of the Far Harbor questline, particularly around questions of identity and memory and what constitutes a person, is some of the best writing in the game. The Easter eggs in Fallout 4 range from the affectionate to the absurd. In Far Harbor's waters, players can find two skeletons on a piece of driftwood, arranged in the way that Rose and Jack were positioned in Titanic's final scenes. After reaching level 20, players can encounter a random event where they see a craft falling from the sky in the distance, which turns out to be a crashed spaceship with an alien survivor and a unique weapon. Codsworth, your pre-war robot, has been programmed with a list of several hundred names that he can call the player character by if that name was common enough in 2077 to have been pre-programmed. The list includes names that the development team apparently found plausible for 2077's demographics, and discovering whether your name is on the list has been a minor rite of passage for Fallout 4 players since launch. Part 9. Factions and their forgotten stories. The Brotherhood, the NCR, and others. Every Fallout game is built around the tension between factions, and the factions are built around the question of how you rebuild civilization from rubble. Different groups have different answers, and the games tend to treat those answers as genuine, rather than obviously correct or obviously wrong. Understanding the major factions, their histories, and their internal contradictions is one of the things that makes Fallout's world feel like more than a backdrop. The Brotherhood of Steel is present in some form in every mainline Fallout game, and its presence is one of the franchise's most reliable through lines. But the Brotherhood is not the same organization across the series. It's been changing since its founding, and different games have caught it at different moments in that change. The Brotherhood was founded in 2077, in the closing moments of the Great War, by a group of U.S. Army soldiers and scientists at a military research base in California called the Mariposa Military Base. Their leader, Roger Maxson, made the decision to break from the chain of command he'd served his entire career, abandon the ongoing war effort, and establish an independent military society dedicated to preserving and protecting pre-war technology. The specific trigger was discovering that Mariposa had been conducting FEV experiments on unwilling human subjects, a moral line that Maxson couldn't cross past. The Brotherhood's founding ideology was complicated from the beginning. They believed that technology was the most valuable thing in the world, and that protecting it from being misused or destroyed was the highest purpose they could serve. What this meant in practice was acquiring technology, hoarding it, and keeping it away from the wasteland's general population. The Brotherhood of Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 was deeply isolationist, treating the outside world as a resource for technology recovery rather than a community to engage with. They collected old-world weapons and machinery and armor, and kept it in their vaults and guarded it, and if the people of the wasteland were dying of preventable diseases, that was sad but not the Brotherhood's problem. This changes across the games in ways that reflect both internal Brotherhood politics and the specific pressures of the regions they operate in. The Lost Hills bunker in California, the Brotherhood's original headquarters, remains isolationist for most of the series. But the expedition to the East Coast that would eventually produce the Capital Wasteland chapter of Fallout 3 went through significant transformation during its long march from the West. The leader of that expedition, Elder Lyons, arrived in D.C. and found a city swarming with super mutants and a population in desperate need of protection, and he made the decision that the Brotherhood should actually help them. This decision fractured the East Coast Brotherhood. Some followed Lyons' more humanitarian approach. Others felt he'd betrayed everything the Brotherhood stood for. The Fallout 4 Brotherhood, led by Elder Maxson, Arthur Maxson, a young man who is a descendant of the original founder and who rose to leadership at an extremely young age, is a more aggressive and militaristic version than Lyons' Brotherhood. It has aircraft. It has a massive airship called the Pridwin. It has an active campaign against synths and any faction it deems a threat to humanity's security. It's also developed a troubling authoritarian edge, defining humanity in ways that exclude ghouls and synths, and imposing its vision of the world's future on the populations it encounters. The game frames the Brotherhood in genuinely ambiguous ways, giving them both compelling heroism and troubling authoritarianism in roughly equal measure. The New California Republic deserves extended attention because it represents something unusual in post-apocalyptic fiction, an attempt at democracy. The NCR grew from the settlement of Shady Sands, which the original Fallout's player character can visit in its very early stages of development. By the time of Fallout 2, set 80 years later, Shady Sands has become the capital of a functional state. By New Vegas's 2281 setting, the NCR is the largest democratic republic in the post-war West, with a population of several million, an elected president, a senate, a professional military, trade routes, and economic activity. It has extended social services, maintains roads, and provides a measure of security in the territories it controls. It also has significant problems. The NCR has grown faster than its institutions can manage. Corruption is endemic. The military is stretched thin across an enormous territorial extent. The democratic process has been captured in many ways by the Brahmin barons, the wealthy cattle ranchers who dominate the NCR's economy and whose interests shape its political decisions in ways that disadvantage ordinary citizens. The veterans returning from the ongoing Mojave campaign face inadequate care and support. The annexation of new territories is sometimes enthusiastic to the point of imperialism. Josh Sawyer designed the NCR for New Vegas specifically to interrogate the idea of democracy in the wasteland. The republic is real. The elections happen. The citizens vote. And the system still produces results that favor the powerful and disadvantage the vulnerable, because that's what systems tend to do when the people inside them are not vigilant. The NCR is neither a villain nor a hero in New Vegas. It's a project, imperfect and ongoing. Caesar's Legion is the philosophical counterpoint to the NCR, and it's worth understanding it seriously rather than dismissing it as simply evil, which the game is careful not to do even though it's clearly the more morally troubling faction. Edward Sallow was a pre-war linguist who joined the followers of the apocalypse after the war and was sent on a research expedition into the American Southwest. His party was captured by a tribal group, and Sallow used his knowledge of history and his considerable intelligence to escape captivity and then turn the experience into something else entirely. He taught himself Roman history in depth and used it as a blueprint for building a society. He became Caesar. He built the Legion. The Legion operates on Roman models, organizing its military on the pattern of Roman cohorts, adopting Latin terminology, creating a strict hierarchy, and maintaining absolute discipline through brutal punishment. It has conquered dozens of tribal groups across the Southwest, forcing them into service and obliterating their previous cultural identities. Women in the Legion are not soldiers. They are property, in explicit and codified ways. But Caesar himself is genuinely intelligent and has a theory of what he's doing that's internally consistent. He understands that the NCR's form of democratic capitalism contains the same seeds that produced the pre-war society that burned the world. He's not wrong about the NCR's weaknesses. His claim that his brutal synthesis will produce a genuinely new and stable civilization, rather than just a repetition of the old failures, is at least a coherent argument, even if it rests on premises about human nature and social structure that are deeply contestable. Engaging with Caesar in dialogue in New Vegas is one of the more interesting intellectual experiences the franchise has offered. The Institute deserves a note here as well, as the fourth major faction of Fallout 4, because it represents something different from all of the above. A post-war institution that has grown so far inward that it has lost any meaningful connection to the world outside its walls. The Institute is what happens when the intellectual tradition turns away from the world it came from and begins to treat that world purely as raw material for its own projects. The Minutemen of Fallout 4, often overlooked in faction discussions, are a deliberate counterpoint to all of these large institutional forces. They're not a nation or an army or a religious order. They're the militia tradition of the original American colonies. The idea that communities should protect themselves and each other without requiring a distant authority to enforce it. In their functional versions, they work. In the form the player finds them in at the beginning of Fallout 4, they've collapsed from desertion and demoralization, and the simple grinding difficulty of trying to help people in a world that keeps finding new ways to threaten them. The Minutemen questline, if pursued, involves rebuilding this network of community defense from effectively nothing, and it's one of the few faction paths in the franchise that ends with something that looks like genuine hope for the settlements, rather than an institutional victory for an organization that may or may not represent the settlement's actual interests. Part 10. Strange Places, Stranger People, the Wasteland's most remarkable characters. Fallout's world is memorable in large part because of the people who live in it, and the franchise has accumulated over 3 decades an extraordinary roster of characters who stick in the memory in ways that go beyond what their narrative function would suggest. Harold is perhaps the most remarkable. Harold first appears in the original Fallout as a ghoul-adjacent mutant running a small trading community in the Hub, a major settlement in the California wasteland. He's been mutated in ways that go beyond standard ghoulification, and he has a small plant growing from his forehead named Bob. Harold is cheerful and helpful and clearly carrying the weight of a long and very unusual life. He appears again in Fallout 2, older and stranger but recognizable, and then he appears in Fallout 3, set on the opposite side of the continent, 2 centuries and 2,000 miles from where he started. In Fallout 3, Harold has been consumed by the plant that was growing on him. He's rooted in the ground in the center of a forest that his tree body has generated, a forest where wanderers go to be healed by the atmosphere Harold radiates. He's been there for years, unable to move, the center of a community that has built up around him. He's in pain, though you have to talk to him to learn that. He seems peaceful, but he's been alone at the center of his grove for so long that the aloneness has become its own kind of suffering. The quest associated with Harold in Fallout 3 is one of the game's more genuinely moving moments. He asks the player to do something for him. What he asks, and whether you do it, is one of those choices that the game presents without judgment and lets you carry. Ulysses, the primary antagonist of Fallout, New Vegas's Lonesome Road DLC, is a character whose relationship to the player character is built almost entirely through absence. He's referenced throughout New Vegas before you ever see him, described by various characters as a courier who carries flags from every faction but owes allegiance to none. He knows the player character from before the events of the game, from a delivery job both couriers were connected to years earlier, and the history between them is revealed gradually across Lonesome Road rather than all at once. What makes Ulysses interesting is his philosophy. He's a man who has been trying to find something worth fighting for in the wasteland and keeps watching things he cares about destroyed. He's not a straightforward villain. He's a person with a grievance that has some legitimacy, who has arrived at a course of action that is terrible, and who can engage in genuine dialogue about why he's doing what he's doing. The final confrontation with Ulysses in Lonesome Road can be resolved through combat or through conversation, and the conversation ending, which requires understanding his philosophy well enough to address it, is the kind of resolution that most games don't attempt because it's hard to write and hard to earn. The King, who runs a gang in Freeside, the impoverished suburbs surrounding the Vegas Strip in New Vegas, is one of the game's best incidental characters. His gang is composed of men who have modeled themselves entirely on Elvis Presley, the rock and roll singer whose cultural footprint survived the apocalypse in the recordings and memorabilia that made it into the vaults. The King has done his Elvis research more thoroughly than anyone else. He's adopted the mannerisms, the clothing, the hairstyle, and to some extent the persona. But underneath the performance, he's actually quite thoughtful and genuinely concerned about the people of Freeside in ways that the Elvis costume makes easy to underestimate. Benny, the man who shoots the player character in the game's opening, is the character in New Vegas who the player is most likely to want revenge against, and the game's design is clever about what it does with that desire. Benny is charming and stylish and completely unprincipled, a man who's made a play for power he's too small to hold, who genuinely convinced himself he could manage something larger than his abilities. When you find him, and what you can do to him or with him is one of the game's more darkly satisfying moments of player choice. Nick Valentine, the synth detective of Fallout 4's Diamond City, carries in his memory banks the personality and memories of a real pre-war detective who was murdered in the chaos of the Great War. The synth containing Nick Valentine doesn't know it's a synth. It woke up in an institute lab, in the body of a machine, with a dead man's memories, and spent years coming to terms with what it is while still being, in all the ways that matter, the person whose memories it carries. Nick is one of the most nuanced companions in the franchise, and one of the most interesting explorations of what synth existence actually means at a personal level. Raul, the Mexican ghoul mechanic companion from New Vegas who is centuries old, presents a specific kind of melancholy. He's lived through the pre-war world, through the bombs, through the immediate chaos of the post-war decades, through the gradual development of the communities and factions that now populate the Mojave. He's seen communities he cared about destroyed. He's seen things get slightly better and then slightly worse, and then slightly better again. He's tired in a way that only applies to people who've had enough time to fully understand how difficult the project of civilization is. His companion quest asks the player to help him find a reason to keep going. The resolution is affecting precisely because the game doesn't promise him an easy answer. It offers him a perspective, a small one. Whether it's enough is left open. Raul's existence also raises a question that New Vegas is more willing to sit with than most games. What does it mean to live long enough to have fully counted the cost of everything? He's not tragic in the way that Youth Robbed is tragic. He's something quieter and harder to name. Someone who has simply had enough time to understand certain things completely and who must decide what to do with that understanding. Part 11. Behind the Terminal's Fallout's environmental storytelling. The holotapes and terminal entries of the Fallout universe form a kind of shadow archive, a record of ordinary life in extraordinary circumstances written by people who didn't expect anyone to read it. The format has been present since the original Fallout, but it reached its maturity in Fallout 3 and continued to develop through subsequent games. The premise is simple. Computers from the pre-war and early post-war world have survived in various states of functionality, and the records they contain can be accessed by a player with the right skills. What those records contain ranges from bureaucratic mundanity to profound personal testimony. Some of the most affecting terminal entries in the series are purely domestic. A shopping list from 2077 that ends mid-entry. The person who was writing it presumably interrupted by the emergency broadcasts. A parent's note about a child's school schedule, carefully formatted and clearly representing a routine that would be interrupted by the end of the world within weeks. An employee's complaints about a coworker stealing lunches from the office refrigerator, 3 entries long, written with the kind of specificity that suggests a person who doesn't know they're writing the final chapters of their pre-war life. The contrast between the mundane content and the apocalyptic context is exactly where much of Fallout's emotional power lies. The world that ended was full of people worried about the same small things people are always worried about: their jobs, their relationships, their children's grades, the neighbor whose Brahmin keep getting into the garden. Reading these records 2 centuries after the bombs fell makes the pre-war world feel real in a way that no amount of art direction quite achieves, because reality has always been fundamentally composed of small concerns. Fallout 4's Boston Public Library contains a sequence of terminal entries from a librarian named Curator Givens, who was trying to preserve the library's collection in the weeks before the bombs fell. He was digitizing physical volumes to holodisks, working frantically to save as many records as he could before whatever was coming arrived. His entries have an urgency that's specifically intellectual. He wasn't primarily worried about his own survival. He was worried about the books. The last entry contains instructions for whoever might find the library. Here is where the data is. Here is what I saved. Here is what I couldn't save in time. Behind the large computer in the library's intelligence section, accessible only by walking through the wall with no clip or finding the right approach, there's a secondary terminal where a player can actually complete the digitization that Givens started, compressing the data he saved and acquiring a holodisk that carries his life's work. Most players never find this because it's completely invisible from normal gameplay. The completion of this hidden Quest Awards experience and the satisfaction of having done something that the game doesn't announce or celebrate, you helped a dead man finish what he started. The Dunwich Borers location in Fallout 4 is one of the game's most effective pieces of environmental horror, told entirely through terminal entries and the experience of descending deeper into the quarry. The quarry's workers began experiencing disturbing visions and behavioral changes as they dug deeper. The entries chart the deterioration over weeks: confusion, then fear, then something that reads like religious awe, then violence. The deeper levels of the quarry contain evidence of pre-human occupation, and the name Dunwich is a direct reference to H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Dunwich Horror, which is about something ancient and wrong being disturbed from where it had been buried. Bethesda uses the illusion deliberately and leans into the cosmic horror implications without ever fully explaining what's down there, which is the right choice. The holotape format allows the games to give voice to characters who would otherwise be entirely absent, people who died before the game's events, who can only communicate through what they left behind. Red Menace, a holotape game within the game found in Fallout 4, was made by a parent for their child. Nick Valentine's pre-war original left behind diary entries that describe falling in love and being happy and being murdered, and the synth that carries his memories can access them, which means that a machine can mourn for the life of a person it never was. The political documents scattered through the Fallout world add a different dimension. Government memos about Project Safehouse, the bureaucratic processes by which ordinary government employees plan the vaults, are written in the tone of routine institutional communications, forms and approvals and procurement requests. The horror of what Vault Tech was building is in some ways sharpest when it's described in the bland language of administrative process. Supply chain verification requests for Vault 12's deliberately defective door seal, performance reviews from the team overseeing Vault 11's sacrifice lottery, corporate communications from Vault Tech's upper management discussing the balance between scientific value and deniability. One of the most quietly devastating sets of terminal entries in the series is found in Fallout 3's Vault 101 in the Overseer's office. Reading through the Overseer's logs over the game's timeline reveals a person who understood what the Vault's experiment required, who believed in it, who made increasingly difficult decisions to maintain the Vault's isolation, and who watched those decisions damage and eventually destroy the community they were meant to preserve. The entries don't make the Overseer sympathetic exactly, but they make the Overseer comprehensible, which is its own kind of disturbing. Fallout. New Vegas has a particularly rich set of terminal entries in the Mojave Outpost, in the Deadwind Cavern area, and throughout the various NCR and Legion camps. The military documentation, orders and logistics reports, and after-action summaries builds a picture of the ongoing Mojave campaign from the inside of the NCR bureaucracy, showing how the day-to-day experience of the soldiers on the ground relates to the strategic goals of the command structure. Spoiler, not always well. The gap between the high-minded democratic rhetoric of the NCR and the actual experience of the soldiers fighting its wars is one of the game's recurring themes, and the terminal entries in military locations are one of its most consistent modes of exploring it. The Sunset Sarsaparilla headquarters in New Vegas contains a competition run by the pre-war soda company, complete with terminal entries from the competition's administrators who are clearly not entirely sure what the grand prize is supposed to be, followed by entries from someone who solved the mystery, found the prize, and was deeply disappointed by what they found. It's comedy delivered through environmental storytelling, pure in form, and it lands because the game has built enough trust through its more serious moments that when it's funny, it feels earned rather than deflating. Part 12. The Wasteland Goes On. Fallout 76, The Amazon Show, and What Comes Next. Fallout 76 arrived in November 2018, and its launch was one of the more dramatically troubled in the franchise's history. The game was Bethesda's first attempt at an online multiplayer Fallout, set in Appalachia, the West Virginia region, just 25 years after the Great War. The premise was that Vault 76, designated as a control vault where the experiment was simply to house a group of America's best and brightest and have them emerge to begin rebuilding civilization, was releasing its dwellers on Reclamation Day. The player character was one of those dwellers, stepping out into a world that was more freshly post-war than any previous game, where the vegetation was beginning to return and the immediate chaos of the bombs was still recent memory. The design choice to have no human NPCs at launch, with the game's story told entirely through robots, terminals, and holotapes, was ambitious in its own way but created a world that felt notably empty. Fallout's emotional power has always depended on human presence, on the people trying to live in the ruins, and a game where all those people were dead or absent before the player arrived stripped something essential from the experience. The launch bugs were significant, including some that genuinely impacted the experience of playing the game rather than just providing cosmetic glitches. A canvas bag advertised as a premium collector's item shipped as nylon. Power armor editions had issues. Server stability was problematic. The press coverage was not kind. Bethesda's response was to continue developing the game through substantial free updates over subsequent years. The Wastelanders update in 2020, which added human NPCs, gave the game much of what players had felt was missing. The Wild Appalachia, Nuclear Winter, and Wastelanders updates collectively expanded the game's content substantially, and the Expeditions and Atlantic City editions continued that expansion. By the mid-2020s, Fallout 76 had a significantly different reputation than it had at launch, with a dedicated player base that genuinely enjoyed what it had become. The Appalachia setting allowed Bethesda to explore regions of the Fallout world that hadn't been visited before, and the environmental and historical specificity of West Virginia gave the game a distinct character. The Flatwoods Monster, a local West Virginia cryptid legend, appears in the game. The Mothman, arguably the most culturally specific creature to the state's mythology, has an elaborate presence. The TNT Dome near Grafton was a real location, an abandoned World War II-era building that in the Fallout universe has a different history. The specific geography of Appalachia, the valleys and the mountains and the rivers and the mining history shaped the game's world in ways that gave it texture even when the player density was thin. The Amazon Prime Video Fallout series, which debuted in April 2024, did something that adaptations of beloved game franchises rarely manage. It was both genuinely good and genuinely faithful to what made the source material worth adapting. The series takes place in 2296, set after the events of Fallout 4, and follows three parallel storylines. Lucy McLean is a Vault 76 dweller who enters the surface world for the first time searching for her father. Maximus is a young Brotherhood of Steel squire trying to prove himself within the institution's rigid structure. And Cooper Howard, a pre-war actor who has spent 219 years as a ghoul, is one of the most morally compromised and compelling characters in the franchise's history. The show doesn't adapt any single game, but draws from the accumulated lore of the series across its history, including elements from Fallout 3, New Vegas, and Fallout 4. The Shady Sands sequence, which reveals what happened to the capital of the New California Republic, was the most discussed and debated moment in the series among longtime fans. The show's answer to what happened to the NCR, and specifically to the major settlement established in the original Fallout and grown in subsequent games, was handled in ways that some fans found satisfying and others found troubling in its implications for the game's established continuity. Cooper Howard as the Ghoul deserves particular attention because he's one of the best characterizations in the franchise's history across any medium. Walton Goggins plays him with a specificity that goes beyond performance, inhabiting both the pre-war man and the post-war remnant with equal conviction. The flashbacks to Cooper's pre-war life, showing a man who was comfortable and successful and beginning to understand uncomfortable truths about the world he lived in, and the present-day sequences showing what surviving 2 centuries has done to him, create a portrait of a person whose arc is genuinely about the relationship between idealism and survival. What do you hold on to when everything else is gone? What do you become when holding on costs everything you were? The second season continued the series' exploration of Fallout's political architecture, introducing new factions and locations, and moving the story's geography toward the territory that Van Buren, the cancelled Black Isle game, had originally planned to use. Whether this convergence with Van Buren's Colorado setting is deliberate and what it means for where the franchise is heading is a question the community is actively discussing. The future of the Fallout franchise in games is being shaped by decisions being made at Bethesda and at Microsoft, which acquired Bethesda's parent company in 2021. Fallout 5 has been confirmed as a project, but the timeline is long. Todd Howard has suggested it will come after The Elder Scrolls 6, which is itself still years away. The question of who might develop Fallout games in the interim, whether Obsidian might return to the franchise for another spin-off, is one that fans raise regularly, and that corporate realities make difficult to predict. A Fallout New Vegas remaster was officially confirmed by Bethesda on the 17th of July 2026. Details remain limited, but the confirmation that the game considered by many to be the franchise's high point is being revisited has been received with enthusiasm by the community. Tim Kaine is back at Obsidian, working on something he won't describe. Josh Sawyer has continued to discuss game design theory and Fallout history in public forums with the generosity that's made him one of the most respected voices in the industry. The franchise that almost didn't exist, that was built by one person working 80-hour weeks out of love for something he believed in, is approaching 30 years old and showing no signs of diminishing relevance. The Wasteland Endures. Part 13. The small details that make it real. The Fallout universe has a quality that its best moments consistently demonstrate: the ability to make you feel the weight of time. Not just the 200 years of game time history, but the texture of individual lives that were lived and ended before you arrived. This quality is built detail by detail, in small decisions that collectively create something that feels genuinely inhabited. The bottle cap economy is one of those details. In the immediate aftermath of the Great War, The survivors needed a medium of exchange that wasn't tied to a collapsed government, that couldn't be counterfeited by the technology available in the early wasteland, and that was durable enough to survive the conditions. Pre-war metal bottle caps, produced in enormous quantities by the Nuka-Cola Corporation and other beverage manufacturers, fit all of these criteria. They couldn't easily be replicated without specialized pre-war manufacturing equipment. They were physically robust. They were already widely distributed. They became currency almost organically, in the way that actual historical currency systems often emerged from the practical needs of trading communities rather than top-down design. The fiction explains bottle cap economies as regional rather than universal. Different parts of the wasteland use different currencies, and the games reflect this. In the capital wasteland, caps are standard. In New California and the Mojave, caps dominate, but NCR paper currency is also accepted in more developed settlements. The tension between the informal cap economy and the NCR's attempt to establish legitimate national currency is a minor but genuine thread in New Vegas, a reflection of the ongoing project of building civilization on terms that everyone will accept. Vault Tech University in Fallout 76 provides extensive documentation of how the company trained its vault overseers, a process that turns out to have been genuinely thoughtful in terms of practical management and catastrophically unethical in terms of what the overseers were being trained to manage. The curriculum materials have the slightly sterile cheerfulness of 1950s corporate training documentation, acknowledging the ethical complexity of the overseer role only obliquely, in language carefully designed to make a person comfortable with things that should make them uncomfortable. The Pip-Boy's design evolution across the games mirrors the in-world development of Robco Industries' consumer technology. The Pip-Boy one was apparently enormous. By the time of the games, the Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV has been refined into something relatively compact that fits around the wrist, though it still looks enormous by our standards for wearable technology. The in-game explanation for why it's so large is that it needs to house its own atomic battery, computing elements built on vacuum tube principles, and a communications array. The design philosophy of miniaturizing not digital components but nuclear ones produces a form factor that makes a specific kind of sense in the Fallout world's technological tradition. The language in the Fallout world has been shaped by the apocalypse in specific ways. Cap for bottle cap, rad for the unit of radiation measurement that became casual speech, Brahmin for the two-headed cattle that dominate the wasteland's agricultural economy, a name that references the Brahmin cattle breed while adding the second H and the Hindu religious resonance simultaneously. Smoothskin, the ghoul term for unirradiated humans, carries a note of contempt that reflects centuries of tension between the two communities. Wastelander has picked up a specific cultural weight, implying not just someone who lives in the wasteland, but someone who has adapted to it. The Brahmin themselves are worth a moment. Two-headed cattle appear in the very first Fallout and have been a fixture of the franchise ever since, serving as livestock, draft animals, and a source of dark humor. Their in-game explanation is radiation-driven mutation producing a second head, though the game's biology doesn't go into much more detail than that. Their existence as a stable breeding population suggests that two-headedness has become a fixed trait rather than a random mutation. From a world-building perspective, the decision to include mutated cattle as an agricultural staple of the wasteland is one of the details that makes the post-war world feel like a place where people have adapted and made do rather than simply suffering. The Nuka-Cola bottles are a design detail that players interact with constantly, since bottle caps function as currency and Nuka-Cola bottles are everywhere in the wasteland. But the specific bottle design, the retro-futuristic rounded form that looks like something you might find in a 1950s diner, was based on reference from that period. The visual design team went deep into mid-century commercial art to get the aesthetic right, and the result is a bottle design that immediately communicates the pre-war era while also being genuinely pleasant to look at. The Nuka-Cola Quantum variety, with its blue glow, required the game's engine to render a light-emitting liquid in a translucent container, which was a technical challenge that the team solved because the visual effect was too good to give up. Fallout 4's settlement system, the ability to build and manage communities across the Commonwealth, connects to the franchise's ongoing thematic interest in what rebuilding civilization actually looks like at a grassroots level. The mechanics can be clunky, and the game's tutorial for them is notorious for being unclear, but the underlying idea that survivors in the wasteland are constantly trying to create something stable and safe and livable is true to the franchise's interests. The settlements you build are small, they're fragile, they need constant attention. That's not a design flaw. That's the point. The companions you travel with in the modern Fallout games react to your settlement decisions, commenting on what you build and how you treat residents and what priorities the player seems to have. These reactions don't change the gameplay in major ways, but they create a sense that the people around you have their own relationship to the project of rebuilding, their own standards and values and preferences. Piper Wright, the investigative journalist from Diamond City who serves as a companion in Fallout 4, is deeply invested in how power structures form in the wasteland, in who gets to tell the stories that shape community identity. Traveling with her through your settlement network feels different from traveling with, say, Strong the Super Mutant, who has a different and less subtle perspective on community organization. The question of power, specifically of who holds it and how it's justified, runs through every Fallout game as a consistent thematic concern. The pre-war world's answer was a combination of corporate power and state authority that claimed to represent the common good while systematically serving narrower interests. The Wasteland's various answers, from Caesar's brutal order, to the NCR's flawed democracy, to the Brotherhood's technological aristocracy, to the Institute's scientific despotism, are all recognizable as things that human societies reach for when they need structure and can't quite arrive at something genuinely equitable. The franchise never quite offers a definitive answer to what should come next. In this, it's more honest than most political fiction, acknowledging that the question is genuinely hard and that the history of human civilization is in large part a history of proposed answers that created new problems. What it does offer, consistently, is the suggestion that paying attention matters, that the small details and the individual choices and the willingness to look at uncomfortable truths are the raw material from which better outcomes are built. Slowly, imperfectly, generation by generation. The wasteland is full of people trying to do that, not heroically, not with certainty, just persistently, in the rubble of a world that didn't have to end the way it did. Part 14. Final Drifts. The quieter corners of the wasteland. There are places in the Fallout games that most players never find, and some of those places are among the most carefully made. The Mojave Outpost, near the south end of Fallout, New Vegas's map, is a stopping point that's easy to pass through without really looking at it. It has a functional use, a place to collect rewards from the Mojave Express and resupply. But the two statues flanking the entrance to the outpost are worth pausing for. They show a man and a woman in pre-war military pose, heroic and forward-looking in the way that pre-war American official art always was. And in the lower right corner of each statue's base, there's a plaque. The plaques are readable. They describe in the formal language of monument dedication what the statues were meant to commemorate, the spirit of cooperation between the NCR and the community it protected. The plaques were placed in 2271. The game takes place in 2281. Whatever cooperation they were commemorating is 10 years gone. The town of Novak in New Vegas has a motel, and the motel has rooms, and most of those rooms are just environment. But one of them, Room 1 at the No-Tell Motel, has a story told through objects alone. A bed that's been slept in recently. A bottle of whiskey, mostly empty. Some NCR currency. And a single holotape. The holotape is a message from a soldier named Jason Bright, who is not the Jason Bright the player meets in the game's Great Conquest line, to someone back home, recording a voice message he might never be able to send. He talks about the desert. He talks about the heat. He talks about a decision he made that he doesn't describe specifically, that clearly weighs on him, that he wants whoever is listening to understand without being able to explain directly. The holotape is 3 minutes long and serves no quest function. In Fallout 3, on a small island in the middle of a river in the capital wasteland, there's a campsite with a skeleton and a fishing rod and a collection of caps sitting in a tin cup. The skeleton has clearly been there for some time. There's nothing else. No journal, no terminal, no holotape. Just someone who went fishing and didn't make it back home. And it's been long enough that no one came to look for them. The switchboard, the underground headquarters of the pre-war Defense Intelligence Agency that features in Fallout 4, contains a set of terminal entries from DIA analysts working in the weeks before the Great War. They knew it was coming. They had intelligence. They were processing information about the Chinese offensive and the American response and the escalating exchange of tactical nuclear weapons. And they were writing their reports and filing their analyses and doing their jobs because their jobs were all they had left to do. The last entries are timestamped hours before the bombs hit Boston. Old World Blues, the New Vegas DLC set in the Big Mountain Research Facility, contains the most explicitly comedic set of environmental storytelling in the franchise. The facility is staffed by disembodied brains in robot bodies, scientists who had their brains removed and placed in containers decades ago as part of research projects and who have been living in this way long enough that they've mostly forgotten what having a body felt like. The scientists are funny and strange and damaged in ways that the game treats with genuine compassion underneath the comedy. The terminals they've left contain years of research notes that veer between genuinely interesting scientific inquiry and the increasingly desperate attempts of isolated minds to find meaning in a situation that's stripped away most of the context that makes meaning possible. The specific kind of loneliness that the Fallout universe describes in its quieter corners is not the loneliness of isolation. It's the loneliness of context loss, the feeling of being the only one who remembers, or the only one who was left, or the only one who cares about this particular thing that used to matter. The wasteland is full of people and creatures and things, but the texture of it is the texture of a world where the connections between things have been severed repeatedly and are being rebuilt slowly, and where some things, some people, some histories are simply not going to make it into whatever comes next. Harold, rooted in his grove, unable to move, hoping someone will help him. The Survivalist, a former soldier whose journals appear in Fallout, New Vegas's Honest Hearts DLC, who kept surviving because he couldn't not, who eventually found a community to protect, who wrote about the people he loved, whose writings the player finds long after he's gone. Nick Valentine, sitting in his detective's office in Diamond City with a dead man's memories, helping people find what they've lost. Because what else is there to do with yourself when you're a machine that feels like a person? The bottle caps in the tin cup on the fishing island in the capital wasteland. These are the things that stay with you from the Fallout games, not the combat encounters or the faction victories, but the specific texture of lives and places rendered with care and attention in the service of a larger story that is, at its deepest level, about whether the project of human civilization is worth continuing. The franchise's answer, consistent across 30 years and dozens of games, and now a television series, has always been a qualified yes. Qualified because the evidence isn't unambiguous. Qualified because the same mistakes keep appearing. But yes, because the fishing trip still happened, and the analysts still wrote their report, and Harold still remembers when he had feet, and the holotapes are still there in the dark, waiting for someone to press play. War, as the opening reminds us at the beginning of every game, never changes. But the people who live in the shadow of war, who pick up the pieces after war, who try to build something in the spaces that war leaves behind, they do change. They have to. And watching that change, in all its messy and painful and occasionally beautiful particularity, is what the Fallout universe has been about since Tim Kaine sat down at his desk before sunrise and started typing. That's our time in the wasteland tonight. We wandered a long way through it, from Tim Kaine's early morning coding sessions in 1995 to the ruins of Boston and the neon of New Vegas and the grove where Harold is rooted in the ground, and we didn't rush anything. If something tonight carried you to the edge of sleep, that's exactly where this was meant to take you. If you found something new in the franchise tonight, or remembered something you'd forgotten, or just found it pleasant to spend a few hours in a world someone made with a lot of care, then we did what we came to do. If you haven't already, leaving a like helps more people find this, and subscribing means you'll be here for the next long drift into a world worth getting lost in. Rest well. The wasteland will still be there when you wake up. End of script. Part 15. Iron Men and Walking Tanks. The History of Power Armor. There are a few images that are synonymous with Fallout regardless of which game you first played or which entry you've spent the most time with. The Pip-Boy is one, the Vault Boy is another. And then there's the silhouette of a person in power armor, the walking tank that has been part of the franchise's visual language since the very first game. Power armor in the Fallout world isn't a magical artifact or a mysterious piece of technology. It has a history, a development timeline, a series of iterations and failures and successes, and a chain of corporate and military decisions that led to it becoming the most recognizable piece of military hardware in the franchise's post-war landscape. Development of powered infantry armor began in earnest in 2065, conducted by West Tech, a major American defense contractor with extensive experience in advanced materials and combat technology. The goal was straightforward: create a suit that would allow a single soldier to carry weapons and absorb damage that would otherwise require a vehicle, while remaining mobile enough to operate in terrain that vehicles couldn't reach. The project was driven by the same logic that had always driven American military development in the Fallout world: the conviction that technological superiority could substitute for numerical disadvantage and reduce the human cost of warfare. The T-45 was the first production model. It entered service in 2067, deployed initially to American forces fighting on the Chinese mainland. The results were mixed in ways that the records of the time describe with careful bureaucratic understatement. The T-45 worked. It protected its wearers significantly better than conventional armor. It allowed soldiers to operate heavy weapons effectively. But it was also enormously energy-hungry, burning through fusion cells at rates that created serious logistical problems. In extended campaigns, the fuel supply chain for T-45 armor became a strategic liability rather than an asset. The armor's joints were also prone to mechanical failure under sustained field use, and the manufacturing process was complicated enough that replacing damaged units required resources that the war effort couldn't always provide. The T-45 was followed by the T-51, which West Tech developed through the early 2070s, while the T-45 units were managing the ongoing conflict. The T-51 addressed the T-45's core energy efficiency problems and improved significantly on the earlier model's structural integrity. By 2076, the T-51B variant was being deployed in Alaska, and the soldiers who fought in the Battle of Anchorage wearing T-51B armor performed sufficiently well that the campaign, though costly, was a strategic success. The T-51B became the benchmark for power armor performance in the final years before the Great War. The lore established in the original Fallout games consistently described it as the best pre-war power armor available, the gold standard against which everything else was measured. The T-60, introduced in Fallout 4, and described there as having been deployed domestically in the months before the war for riot control and civil enforcement, represents a later development that sits somewhat uncomfortably with earlier lore. The canonical explanation that has emerged from the fan community's analysis of the various sources is that the T-60 was indeed produced in 2077, in the final frantic months before the bombs fell, but that production volumes were limited enough that it never reached the battlefield in the same numbers as the T-51. The Brotherhood of Steel's East Coast chapter, which uses T-60 as its standard armor in Fallout 4, acquired significant stocks of it from military installations in the Capital Wasteland region, rather than from West Coast Brotherhood caches. This reconciles the earlier lore without entirely eliminating the tension. The X-1, which appears as the most advanced armor tier in Fallout 4, has its own complicated history. In the original lore established by Fallout 2, the X-1 was specifically a post-war design, created by the Enclave using pre-war research. The Enclave took the X-1 designation because they were continuing the military's prototype numbering, and the armor was intended as their proprietary successor to the pre-war lineup. In Fallout 4, X-1 suits can be found in pre-war military installations throughout the Commonwealth, which implies that at least some units were produced and distributed before the war. The discrepancy is another example of the kind of lore tension that accumulates over a franchise spanning multiple games, multiple development teams, and decades of expanded storytelling. Power armor in Fallout operates on a fusion core, a compact nuclear battery that powers the suit for a specific period of sustained use. The concept of fusion cores, introduced in Fallout 4 as a gameplay mechanic, retroactively explains how the suits function as self-contained fighting vehicles rather than requiring external power. In practical lore terms, fusion cores can last for years of normal use, but deplete relatively quickly under combat conditions, which is a design compromise between tactical utility and logistical practicality. The Brotherhood of Steel's relationship to power armor is foundational to the organization's identity. From its founding, the Brotherhood has treated power armor as both a practical tool and a symbolic artifact, something that represents the best of pre-war technology, and that they are specifically ordained to preserve and operate. In the first two Fallout games, Brotherhood membership was essentially required to operate power armor, not just narratively but mechanically. The player needed the power armor skill, which could only be learned from the Brotherhood, to put on a suit without incurring severe movement penalties. This created a genuine sense of the armor as specialized, esoteric technology rather than just a piece of equipment anyone could pick up. Fallout 4 changed this for narrative and design reasons, with T-45 suits available to the player character early in the game with no training requirement. The lore justification offered is that by the time of Fallout 4's events, power armor training has become more widespread, with the NCR, various military organizations, and eventually even raider groups developing the knowledge base to maintain and operate the suits. Whether this represents genuine series evolution or a simplification for gameplay access is a debate that the fan community has not finished having. The way power armor degrades over 200 years without maintenance is a detail that the games handle differently. Fallout 3 and New Vegas featured suits that were largely functional finds, needing repairs, but basically operational. Fallout 4 introduced the frame and component system, where the structural frame of a suit is separate from its individual armor pieces, and those pieces can be damaged, replaced, upgraded, and customized extensively. The suits you find in Fallout 4's world are often in severe disrepair, missing pieces, or running on nearly dead fusion cores, which creates a sense that the Wasteland has been using and depleting this equipment for 2 centuries, and that finding a pristine set is genuinely exceptional. Liberty Prime, the enormous pre-war military robot that Fallout 3's Brotherhood of Steel reactivates, and that has become one of the franchise's most beloved secondary characters, was built to be the ultimate answer to the Sino-American War's Chinese opposition. The robot stands roughly 40 feet tall, carries a nuclear bomb in each hand that it throws at targets like grenades, and narrates its activities with patriotic slogans that were designed to boost morale and project American values. Phrases like "death is a preferable alternative to communism" and "the purity of the American way will never be extinguished" are delivered with the enthusiastic sincerity of the era's propaganda, and Liberty Prime delivers them while atomizing Chinese robots and super mutants with equal enthusiasm. The franchise uses Liberty Prime for comedy in ways that also carry genuine satirical weight. The most powerful weapon in the capital wasteland is an enormous robot that can only express itself through 1950s anti-communist slogans. Part 16. Ghoul Stories. Lives lived across centuries. The ghoul condition, as Fallout has developed it across 30 years of games, produces a specific kind of character that is almost unique in post-apocalyptic fiction. People who lived through the disaster that created the world the story is set in. Most post-apocalyptic narratives deal with survivors of a founding disaster who are already dead by the time the story begins, leaving only records and ruins. Fallout's ghouls break this pattern. Harold, whom we've discussed, lived in the pre-war world as a normal human being. Roy Phillips, a ghoul supremacist in Fallout 3 who wants Tenpenny Tower for himself and his people, was once someone else, someone before. The ghoul of the Amazon television series, Cooper Howard, was a successful film actor in 2077 who made westerns and was beginning to understand uncomfortable truths about the country he'd spent his career celebrating. The specific experience of being a long-lived ghoul in the Fallout world is not often addressed directly in the games, but the hints are consistent and build to something significant. You have survived things that everyone around you cannot understand. You have watched communities form and dissolve. You have seen hope arrive and fail. You have outlived the people who mattered to you repeatedly, which eventually requires either a different relationship with attachment or a kind of philosophical resignation that isn't quite peace but looks like it from a distance. Raul, the New Vegas companion we mentioned earlier, is one of the game's most extended meditations on this experience. Born in Mexico City in 2047, he has lived through the bombs, through the immediate chaos of the post-war decades in the Mexican wasteland, through personal tragedy involving his family, through a period as an outlaw, through a long career as a mechanic attached to various communities across the Southwest. He's more than 230 years old by the events of New Vegas. The voice performance by Danny Trejo brings a specific quality to him, a heaviness that sounds like earned tiredness rather than performed world weariness. His companion quest, Old School Ghoul, asks the player to engage with the question of whether someone who has lived that long can find a reason to keep going. Two very different veterans of the wasteland, one human and one ghoul, offer Raul different perspectives on this question. The ranger, who has fought and survived through sheer stubbornness and a commitment to the people around him, makes one kind of argument. A reformed raider, who traded violence for community and found it sufficient, makes another. Neither answer is definitively correct in the game's terms. Both are presented as genuine possibilities. Raul listens, and at the end of his quest, something in him shifts, though the game is careful not to make that shift too clean or too complete. The ghoul of the Amazon show, whom fans have taken to calling simply the ghoul rather than by his pre-war name Cooper Howard, represents a different kind of long ghoul life. One that has been spent in active and sometimes brutal pursuit of survival in conditions that didn't reward softness. Where Raul has achieved a kind of stability through service, the ghoul has been shaped by the wasteland into something harder to categorize. He remembers Cooper Howard. He is still Cooper Howard in certain ways, in the knowledge and the responses and the specific pains that survive from his pre-war life. But he is also something the wasteland made of that material over 2 centuries, and the two of them don't always agree. What the show does particularly well with Cooper's character is the way it uses the pre-war flashbacks not just as world-building, but as emotional context for the present-day ghoul. Understanding who he was makes understanding who he is, both more illuminating and more painful. The man who made those westerns, who believed in those American myths, who was beginning to see the cracks in them, and couldn't quite bring himself to look directly at what was behind the cracks. That man's long survival into a world where the cracks became chasms, became catastrophe, is one of the most resonant things the Fallout universe has produced in any medium. The question of feral ghoul deterioration, the gradual loss of cognition and personality that some ghouls undergo, becomes pressing in this context. If you've lived for 2 centuries, and you know that something can happen to your mind that will take away everything you still are, what do you do with that knowledge? The games don't address this directly for long-lived ghoul characters, but the awareness of it shapes the reading of those characters. Raul doesn't mention feral deterioration. Harold doesn't. The ghoul doesn't. But it's there, implicit in the condition, a background weight on every conversation. There are ghouls in the Fallout universe who have made peace with what they are, and ghouls who have not. The game's ghoul supremacist characters, who have taken the perspective that ghouls are superior to baseline humans because of their extended lifespan and radiation resistance, represent one kind of response to the condition's challenges. Convert them into a kind of pride and build an identity around them. Roy Phillips in Fallout 3 is doing this. The glowing ones, ghouls who have absorbed so much radiation that they glow and can emit it, have sometimes formed their own communities with their own cultures, finding solidarity in their shared transformation. The most interesting ghouls in the franchise are usually the ones who haven't resolved the question of what they are. The ones who are still in the middle of it, still working out how to live inside a condition that neither the pre-war world nor the post-war world has any adequate framework for. They're carrying more history than anyone around them can fully receive, trying to be present in a moment that is almost incomprehensibly small compared to everything that came before it. Part 17. The sound of the apocalypse music in the Fallout world. Sound design and music are one of the most underappreciated dimensions of the Fallout experience, and the franchise's use of music is one of the ways it most consistently succeeds at doing something that should be impossible, making a radioactive wasteland feel like somewhere you want to spend time. The music strategy across the games falls into 2 broad categories. The diegetic music, meaning the music that exists within the fictional world and that your character can hear just as you can, comes primarily from the in-game radio stations. The non-diegetic score, the music playing in the background of exploration and combat that your character theoretically can't hear, has evolved significantly across the series. The radio music of Fallout 3 and New Vegas is built around music from the 1940s and 1950s, the era that the pre-war world's culture froze at. Songs by artists like Cole Porter, Bing Crosby, Dean Martin, and Bob Crosby sit alongside novelty songs and swing instrumentals that capture the specific flavor of that period's pop music. These songs were specifically licensed by the development teams, and the licensing decisions shaped the specific emotional texture of each game. Fallout 3's Galaxy News Radio, operated by Three Dog and his team, plays a selection that leans into the post-apocalyptic irony more explicitly than New Vegas's selections. Butcher Pete, an energetic song about a man who breaks open all the women's briskets, becomes suddenly funnier and stranger when you realize you've been listening to it while dismembering raiders with a power fist. Anything Goes takes on a different resonance when everything has literally gone. I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire, played at the very beginning of the game, is the thesis statement of the game's tonal relationship with its source material. New Vegas's Radio New Vegas and the Mojave Music Radio make different selections, reflecting the different culture of the West and the different history of the Las Vegas setting. The Rat Pack era of American musical entertainment is strongly represented. Luck Be a Lady, performed by a genuine Frank Sinatra recording, plays over a city that is still defined by gambling and luck and the specific mythology of Las Vegas. Blue Moon, Johnny Guitar, and Why Don't You Do Right round out a playlist that feels like it was curated by someone who understood both what these songs meant in their original context and what they mean playing over a post-nuclear casino economy. Inan Zur, who composed the non-diegetic scores for Fallout 3, Fallout, New Vegas, Fallout 4, and Fallout 76, built a musical language for the series that is recognizable as Fallout across all 4 games. His approach involves thematic material that feels simultaneously ancient and synthetic, using orchestral elements alongside electronic textures to create something that sounds like memory and distance and the specific quality of exploring a place where time has done something unusual. The main theme of Fallout 3 is built around a simple melodic idea that becomes associated with the wasteland's melancholy through repetition and development, so that hearing it immediately triggers the emotional state of wandering through ruins with no clear path. Fallout 4's score introduced a more action-oriented element to Zur's approach, with combat music that pushed into harder, more percussive territory than the earlier games. This reflected the more action-oriented design of Fallout 4 itself, but also its specific setting. The Commonwealth's environment is more actively dangerous in some ways than the Capital Wasteland or the Mojave, and the music responds to that. Fallout 76's score had the unusual challenge of needing to function in a shared online environment where moments couldn't be as precisely curated as in a single-player game. Zur's solution involved a more ambient and atmospheric approach than the previous games, building music that could loop and shift without feeling repetitive over extended play sessions. The specific songs chosen for the radio stations are often discussed by players in terms of which ones they remember most strongly, and the association of specific songs with specific playthrough moments is one of the more personal dimensions of the Fallout experience. Someone who was exploring the DC Mall at night for the first time when A Kiss to Build a Dream On came on over, Galaxy News Radio has a relationship with that song that is permanent and specific. Someone who found the Goodsprings Cemetery at dawn with Ain't That a Kick in the Head playing has a memory attached to that song that no other context can fully displace. The sound effects of the Fallout games, which don't get discussed as much as the music, but contribute enormously to the atmosphere, are built around an interesting tension. Modern weapons and combat have modern sounds, which is to say realistic sounds derived from real-world firearms and explosives. But the pre-war technology, the laser rifles and plasma weapons and fusion-powered devices, have sounds built around a mid-century science fiction aesthetic. Laser rifles in Fallout sound like laser rifles in 1950s science fiction films, because that's the aesthetic tradition they come from. The Plasma Caster, a high-end energy weapon in several games, has a distinctive, wobbly resonance that sounds like it was sampled from a 1950s science fiction props department and then processed through modern audio software. This sound design decision reinforces the game's central tension. The advanced technology of the Fallout world sounds retro-futuristic because it was designed in a world that never left the 1950s. The weapons that should sound most modern, the energy weapons and power-armored soldiers and robotic guards, sound most vintage, while the conventional firearms sound contemporary. The apocalypse arrives through the most modern-sounding technology, the nuclear bombs, and the world left behind is navigated with a combination of modern-sounding conventional weapons and retro-sounding future tech. Nothing quite fits together cleanly, and the audio reinforces that. Part 18. Everyday life in the ruins. How people actually live. One of the things that the Fallout games do that sustains their world through dozens of hours of exploration is show you, in consistent detail, how ordinary life actually functions in the wasteland. Not the dramatic moments, not the faction politics, not the legendary weapons in the final dungeons, but the texture of surviving day to day. The economy of the wasteland is a patchwork of systems that reflect both the specific resources available in each region and the particular history of each settlement. Bottle caps are the common currency across most of the game's settings, but the specifics vary. In New California and the Mojave, NCR paper currency circulates alongside caps in settlements with significant NCR presence, but the exchange rate fluctuates based on political trust in the NCR's stability. In the capital wasteland, caps are essentially universal. In the Commonwealth, caps are standard, but pre-war money is occasionally accepted by certain vendors who have nostalgic or practical reasons to value it. The goods that circulate in these economies tell you a great deal about how the wasteland functions. Stimpaks, the self-administered medical devices that appear in every game, are products of pre-war pharmaceutical manufacturing that have been found in vast quantities across the country. 200 years after the war, Stimpaks are still being found in the ruins of hospitals and military depots and pharmacies, which says something about both the scale of pre-war pharmaceutical production and the rate at which the post-war population has consumed and needed them. In some games, particularly the later ones, there are also post-war produced Stimpaks, manufactured by the followers of the apocalypse or by the various chemical operations that exist in different regions. The quality and availability varies. Food in the wasteland comes from multiple sources that reflect the ecological transformation of the world. Brahmin, the two-headed mutated cattle, are the primary source of meat across most of the game's settings, and their milk is also consumed and traded. Pre-war preserved food still exists and is edible, which strains credulity somewhat, but which the games have always made canon. You can eat a pre-war fancy lad's cake found in a 200-year-old building, and it will restore your health. The preservation quality of pre-war food packaging apparently extends across centuries of radiation exposure. Mutfruit, a mutated fruit crop that grows in the Commonwealth, has become a cultivated food source. Crops in general are more available in regions where the soil has recovered enough radiation to support them, and the games reflect this regional variation in what food is most common and most affordable. Water is a consistent theme because it's the resource that's most obviously been affected by the war. Most surface water in the United States is irradiated to some degree, and drinking it untreated causes radiation damage. The specific level of contamination varies by region and by proximity to blast sites. Clean water is therefore a traded commodity in areas without reliable purification, and the technology of water purification is one of the most valuable practical capabilities a settlement can have. Fallout 3's main quest culminates in the activation of Project Purity, a water purification system capable of distributing clean water across the capital wasteland, which is another indication of how fundamental this need is to the setting. Medical care in the wasteland is a fragmented patchwork that varies enormously by settlement. Larger, more stable communities like Diamond City and Fallout 4 or New Vegas's major hospitals have actual trained medical practitioners. Smaller settlements rely on Stimpaks and Radaway and the knowledge of whoever happens to have the most experience with bodies. The Followers of the Apocalypse, a faction that appears in multiple games, is specifically dedicated to providing medical care and other practical services to wasteland communities without the ideological commitments of the larger factions. Their presence or absence in a region measurably affects the quality of medical care available there. Children in the wasteland, by the logic of the game world, are born into communities and grow up learning the specific skills that their community values. In vault communities, children grow up learning the vault's particular role and structure. In raider communities, children are socialized into raider culture from an early age, and the games avoid showing this process directly but acknowledge its existence through adult raider characters who reference growing up within raider bands. In settled wasteland communities, children learn farming or trading or mechanics or whatever the community needs. The question of education is addressed intermittently across the games. Some settlements have functioning schools of a kind, places where children learn reading and practical skills. The Followers of the Apocalypse specifically prioritize literacy and knowledge preservation as part of their mission. The Brotherhood of Steel has an extensive internal education system for its members and their children, which is partly why they're one of the most functionally capable factions in the Wasteland, despite being relatively small in numbers. Recreation and culture in the Wasteland is another area the games address more than you might expect. The Sunset Sarsaparilla competition in New Vegas suggests that people engage with commercial entertainment in new forms. The competition runs on bottles found in the Wasteland rather than purchased, but it functions as a kind of game within the game that people have been playing for years. The casinos of New Vegas provide entertainment at a level that's unprecedented in the post-war world, which is a significant part of why New Vegas itself has so much political significance. The ability to offer something beyond mere survival is a kind of power that no other settlement in the Mojave can match. Radio is perhaps the most consistently visible form of mass culture in the wasteland, because radios survived the apocalypse better than most technologies, and because the pre-war infrastructure of radio transmission has partially restored itself through salvaged and rebuilt equipment. Three Dogs Galaxy News Radio, Mojave Music Radio, Radio New Vegas, and the various other stations across the game's settings provide entertainment, news, and a form of community to people who are otherwise isolated. The knowledge that someone is out there, broadcasting, maintaining connection across a shattered landscape, has a specific significance that the games understand and build into how radio stations are written and voiced. The culture of the wasteland, in aggregate, is a patchwork of the pre-war culture that survived in recordings and texts, the specific adaptations that different communities developed in the decades after the war, and the ongoing creative work of people making new things under difficult conditions. It's not a dead culture. It's a strange and specific living one, growing in the direction that the resources and the pressures and the surviving material push it. Part 19. Lost and Found Cut Content and What Almost Was. Across 30 years of Fallout games, the gap between what was planned and what shipped has consistently been one of the most interesting areas of study for the community. Cut content tells a story about the creative process and about the economic and technical realities of game development that the finished products can't communicate directly. The original Fallout had its own cuts. The time limit that created pressure in the early game was originally harsher than the shipped version, creating a more genuinely desperate experience at the cost of some of the game's accessibility. A fully planned sequel location was cut for time. Several NPC interactions were simplified or removed. Fallout 2's cut content is particularly extensive because the sequel was rushed to release to meet commercial targets, and the result was a game that shipped with significant areas that weren't fully finished. The game's final version, while still remarkable, had whole sections of its world that felt undercooked compared to the team's ambitions. The Fallout 2 Restoration Project, a fan-made mod that restored hundreds of cut elements, is one of the most substantial community efforts in the franchise's history, and the restored content is extensive enough to feel like a significantly different and fuller game. Fallout 3's cut content includes a complete alternate ending that was built and then removed, an earlier version of the game's climax that played out differently and apparently created technical problems that were easier to cut than to fix. The stealth indicator system, which we've mentioned, was a more nuanced design than what shipped. Various weapon variants and NPC interactions were trimmed. New Vegas's cut content, as we've discussed, is substantial enough to fill a separate game. The July 2010 build discovered at a Utah game store contained masses of content that was removed in the final months of development, some of it cut for optimization and some for time. The cut companions alone, characters who made it through design and scripting and partial voicing before being removed, would have meaningfully expanded the game's companion roster. Fallout 4's underwater vault, the giant squid, the functioning combat zone, the centaurs, these represent a pattern that the franchise repeats. Ambitious early design, practical compression toward release, fragments left in the files. The files don't judge, they just preserve what was there. Fallout 76's cut content is a different kind of archive. As an online game, 76 has gone through more post-release changes than any previous Fallout title, and the evolution of what the game contains has been tracked by data miners across years of updates. Content that was planned for one season and not included, story elements that were set up and not followed through, characters who appeared in files without appearing in the game. The living development history of an online game creates a different kind of cut content documentation than a shipped and finished single-player title. There's something poignant about cut content archives in general, and the Fallout community's relationship to them in particular. These are the shadows of things that almost were, decisions made in difficult circumstances, creative work that got done and then didn't get used. The people who wrote the dialogue for New Vegas's cut companions, who built the model for Fallout 4's giant squid, who scripted the interactions for Fallout 2's unfinished sections, they put real effort into those things, and the things didn't make it. But they're still there, in the files, recoverable, and the community finds them and marks them and talks about them, which is its own kind of preservation. Part 20. The Long Sleep, a final meditation on the wasteland. We've been in the wasteland for a long time tonight. Through its history and its horror, its strange creatures and its stranger people, Its canceled games and its rushed ones and its cut content and its hidden terminals and its 200 years of ordinary lives lived in extraordinary circumstances. The thing that holds all of this together, beyond the fictional universe, beyond the accumulated lore and the developer decisions and the player discoveries, is something simpler. The Fallout universe is a space where people have thought very carefully about what it means to keep going when the structures that organized your life are gone, when the institutions you depended on have failed, when the certainties you built yourself around have been revealed as provisional, when the world you thought you understood has turned out to be something other than what you thought. That's not a situation that only exists in science fiction. It's a situation that people encounter in various forms throughout their lives, though rarely in the dramatic post-nuclear sense. The wasteland exaggerates the condition to make it visible. The radiation and the mutants and the collapsed civilization are the metaphor writ large. What the franchise is actually asking, in every game and in every piece of lore, is, when everything falls apart, what do you hold on to? What do you build? What do you become? The answers it offers are as varied as the franchise's settings and factions and characters. Some people become the Brotherhood of Steel, gathering the best of what was and protecting it from those who might use it badly. Some people become the NCR, trying to recreate the democratic structures that failed the first time and hoping they can make them work better on the second attempt. Some people become Caesar's Legion, deciding that the old structures failed because they were too soft and that what's needed is something harder. Some people become the Minutemen, trying to protect each other without requiring a governing authority to enforce it. Some people become Herald, rooted in place, generating life around themselves because that's what they have left to give. The people who make it through the wasteland, who build something sustainable and maybe even good, are almost always the ones who manage to hold two things simultaneously. The weight of what was lost, which keeps them honest and keeps them caring, and the ability to act in spite of that weight, which keeps them moving. The games reward this orientation. The best outcomes in Fallout are almost never the ones where a faction wins cleanly and imposes its vision on everyone else. They're the ones where the player character has been patient and thorough enough to build something that multiple communities can live inside, where the texture of the outcome reflects the texture of the journey. That's what we've been doing tonight, in our own small way. Wandering through the ruins slowly, picking up what's there, not rushing to the next checkpoint, letting the world be itself for a while before we move on. The wasteland is always there when you need it. Tim Kaine is still working on something new. The franchise's next chapter is being written somewhere in offices where people care about getting it right. And right now, wherever you are, the night is quiet and you have nowhere to be. That's enough. Rest well. If you found your way through to the end of this one, thank you for spending the time. If you're still awake, leave a comment with where in the world you are and what time it is. There's something I've always liked about knowing where these long nights reach. A like takes a second and helps more people find a quiet place to land. And if you're not already subscribed, I'd be glad to have you here for the next one. Sleep well. The wasteland will still be there when you wake up. Interlude. Things that endure. The franchise's quietest successes. Before we finish, it's worth spending some time on the things that have endured across the franchise, not because they're dramatic or plot central, but because they've proven to be so specifically right for the world that nobody has ever wanted to change them. The Vault Boy, the cheerful, cartoonish figure that appears on perk screens, on Pip-Boy interfaces, on merchandise and promotional materials and loading screens, is one of the most recognizable mascots in gaming. He's based on the visual style of American mid-century promotional illustration, the same graphic tradition that produced the cheerful figures in government pamphlets and corporate advertising from the 1940s and 1950s. He's always smiling. He's always giving a thumbs up. He appears on perk cards and skill descriptions and advantage notifications in exactly the same relentlessly positive tone regardless of what the perk does. The Bloody Mess perk, which makes enemies explode more dramatically when killed, is illustrated with a grinning Vault Boy. The perk that makes radiation more dangerous is illustrated with a grinning Vault Boy. The disconnect between his unfailing enthusiasm and the content he's illustrating is a joke that never gets old, precisely because the Vault Boy never wavers. His optimism is impervious to context, which was the pre-war world's problem too. The Vault Tech mascot, which is a different character from the Vault Boy, though visually similar, appears on Vault architecture and promotional materials and represents the corporate face of the shelter program. The branding of Vault Tech, The typography and the blue and yellow color scheme and the rounded geometric aesthetic is coherent and specific enough to feel like a real mid-century American corporation's visual identity. Someone on the art team at Interplay in the mid-1990s made a series of decisions about how Vault-Tec should look that have proven durable enough to be maintained through every subsequent game and through the television. Adaptation. That's 30 years of brand consistency for a fictional corporation in a fictional universe. It's a small achievement in the grand scheme, but it's the kind of thing that makes a fictional world feel solid. The VATS system, the Vault-Tec Assisted Targeting System, is the franchise's answer to the challenge of maintaining the tactical, deliberate feel of turn-based combat within a real-time framework. The original Fallout games were turn-based, allowing players to queue actions and execute them in sequence. Moving to real-time combat in Fallout 3 required finding a way to preserve some of that deliberate, calculated quality. VATS, which pauses the game and allows the player to target specific body parts and queue attacks, achieved this in a way that also became one of the franchise's most cinematically satisfying mechanics. The slow-motion camera that plays out the VATS sequence, the headshot that sends an enemy flying dramatically into the environment, the gory spectacle of critical hits, these became associated with Fallout, specifically in ways that distinguished it from other post-apocalyptic action games. The perk system is another element that has been present since the original game and has evolved significantly across the franchise without losing its essential character. Perks are special abilities that players choose as they level up, and in the original Fallout, they represented a specific design philosophy. Reward players for investing in the game's role-playing aspects by offering abilities that transformed how you could interact with the world. Some perks opened dialogue options, some changed how specific types of combat worked. Some had ongoing effects on the game's simulation. The best perks in the series are the ones that have interesting side effects on the world rather than just numbers. A perk that makes you more charismatic also changes how some NPCs talk to you, not just what you can say to them. A perk that improves your hacking opens terminals that were previously inaccessible and therefore opens up lore that was previously hidden. Perks in their best implementations are keys to rooms you didn't know existed. The Fallout Bible, a series of documents released online by Black Isle writer Chris Avellone in the early 2000s, was an attempt to systematize and canonize the franchise's lore at a time when the games themselves had left significant gaps. Avellone compiled answers to frequently asked questions about the setting, established timelines, and explained apparent inconsistencies, and in doing so created a resource that the fan community has treated as authoritative for 20 years. The Fallout Bible isn't completely consistent with everything subsequent games have established, because that's the nature of franchise continuity across multiple development teams over long periods. But it represents a genuine and generous act of lore stewardship that gave the community a shared foundation. The Enclave is a faction that has appeared across multiple games and been handled with varying degrees of nuance. At its core, the Enclave is what remains of the United States federal government, or at least what claims to be that remnant. It has maintained continuity through the Great War and the post-war period via facilities that were hardened against nuclear attack, including oil rigs in Fallout 2, and facilities scattered across the eastern and western United States in later games. It has functional technology at a level that most Wasteland factions can't match. It has an ideological commitment to restoring America to what it was, though its definition of what America was tends to be more exclusive and more violent than the democratic ideals it claims to represent. The Enclave's specific villainy in different games reflects different aspects of what can go wrong when an institution preserves its structures without preserving its values. In Fallout 2, the Enclave's plan to deploy FEV-contaminated water to kill anyone with post-war mutations, which is essentially everyone outside the Enclave's own population, is a genocide justified by purity standards that the Enclave applies only to others. In Fallout 3, President Eden is a computer that has been running the Enclave for decades without anyone noticing the disconnect between its continued operation and the human oversight that should be governing it. A story about what happens when institutional authority becomes untethered from human judgment. In Fallout 76, the Enclave's Appalachian remnant reveals how the organization has different factions and internal politics rather than being a monolithic evil, which adds complexity while also showing how those factions can still arrive at terrible outcomes through ostensibly reasonable processes. The followers of the apocalypse are, in some ways, the moral counterpoint to the Enclave, an organization that has also survived the post-war period with a coherent ideology, but whose ideology is service rather than restoration. The followers provide medical care, education, and practical assistance to wasteland communities without asking for political loyalty in return. They archive knowledge because knowledge has intrinsic value regardless of who uses it. They treat supermutants and ghouls as people because their medical ethics don't make distinctions based on mutation status. The tension between the followers' idealism and the practical difficulty of operating without military force or political authority is a consistent source of drama in the games where they appear. In New Vegas, the followers are chronically under-resourced and have difficulty maintaining their operations in the face of the larger factions' conflicts. Their hospital facility in Freeside is perpetually struggling. Individual followers have to make decisions about how to balance their principles with the reality of operating in a dangerous world where principles don't always provide protection. Arcade Ganon's companion quest in New Vegas is partly about this tension, about a man who trained in medicine with the followers' ethical framework and who has to decide what that means when the principles are in conflict with the political outcomes he wants to see. Part 21. Inside the Mojave's Hidden Corners. New Vegas's Mojave Wasteland rewards exploration in ways that accumulate slowly and that individual players experience very differently based on what order they discover things in and what choices they've made by the time they arrive at various locations. Vault 11, which we discussed in the context of Vault-Tech's experiments, is one of the most complete pieces of storytelling in the franchise, but the way the game delivers its story is worth dwelling on. The player arrives at an apparently abandoned vault and begins exploring, finding evidence of a population that existed here for decades. The holotapes and terminals tell the story in a specific order if the player explores methodically, but most players don't explore methodically and piece the story together in a less linear sequence. The effect of discovering the Sacrifice Lottery's records before discovering the early settler logs, or vice versa, creates genuinely different emotional experiences of the same story. The vault's design rewards whatever order you arrive at the information in. Vault 22, a few hours travel from Vault 11, had a different experiment with different and also terrible results. The population was given a mandate to develop plants that could grow in post-nuclear conditions to ensure food security in the event of civilization's collapse. The research was successful in ways the researchers didn't anticipate. The plant life they cultivated became aggressive and eventually dominant, overrunning the vault's systems and killing most of the dwellers, while also creating an ecosystem that has since spread outside the vault into the Mojave's cave systems. The vault, when the player arrives, is a living greenhouse, plants growing through every surface, evidence of the population that worked and lived and died there half dissolved into the vegetation. It's beautiful and disturbing in roughly equal measure. Zion Canyon, the setting of the Honest Hearts DLC, is one of the most visually distinct locations in the franchise. It's based on Zion National Park in Utah, and the team worked to render the specific quality of that landscape, the red rock and the canyon depth and the green vegetation along the valley floor. In the post-war context, the canyon has been relatively protected from the worst radiation by its geography, and as a result, it has a lushness that stands out dramatically from the standard Mojave Desert. The story of Honest Hearts is about tribal communities living in Zion, about a caravan from New Vegas that gets caught in a conflict between those communities, and about a man named Daniel who has brought Christian faith to one of the tribes and who is trying to decide whether to protect them by helping them flee or by helping them fight. The Burned Man, Joshua Graham, is the DLC's other major figure, a former general of Caesar's Legion who was burned and thrown into the Grand Canyon as punishment for a military failure, who survived by some combination of luck and determination, and who has since found something like faith in the same religious tradition Daniel represents. The conversation between Daniel and Joshua Graham about violence and righteousness and what God requires of people who have done terrible things is one of the finest pieces of writing in the series. It's a genuine theological discussion conducted between two people who have arrived at different conclusions from shared premises, and the game doesn't resolve it definitively. Daniel's position that taking life is always a cost even when it's necessary, and Joshua's position that there is a kind of justice that requires active defense and that passivity in the face of evil is its own moral failure, are both presented as held by people of genuine conviction. The player's choices move the resolution in one direction or another, but the game doesn't judge the unresolved argument. The survivalists' journals, found scattered across Zion, tell a story that has nothing to do with the DLC's main plot. A former soldier named Randall Clark arrived in Zion after the Great War and spent decades there alone, surviving, occasionally encountering and avoiding the tribal groups that came through, writing about what he saw and felt and thought. His journals, written for no audience initially, become addressed over time to the descendants of a tribal group he began watching over from a distance. He never made contact. He just watched, and helped when he could without being seen, and eventually died. The last journal entries are among the most affecting things in the series. Clark's relationship to the people he'd been silently caring for, and his acceptance that his time was ending, is handled with a restraint that would have been easy to breach into sentimentality, and that the writing consistently refuses. He was a soldier who survived things that should have killed him, and who found eventually something worth protecting. The game marks his grave. When you find it, if you've been reading his journals as you discover them, the discovery has the weight of having known someone. The Dead Money DLC is designed to be difficult, both mechanically and emotionally, in ways that the other New Vegas add-ons largely avoid. The player is stripped of their equipment and sent into the Sierra Madre Casino, a pre-war luxury resort that has been sealed off and made lethal by a combination of toxic red cloud and ghostly holograms, and the specific dangers of the casino itself. The three companions the player is given in Dead Money, each of whom has been enslaved by a bomb caller and is being coerced into cooperating, are each carrying traumas and resentments and desperate needs that the DLC explores over the course of the story. The theme of Dead Money is stated explicitly by its antagonist, Father Elijah, who has become obsessed with the Sierra Madre Casino and the wealth it represents. Let go. The trap at the center of the Sierra Madre is the belief that what's inside it is worth any cost to possess. Elijah can't let go of the casino. The other characters have their own things they can't let go of. The DLC ends by asking the player to let go too, of the wealth and the experience and the investment they've made, and the choice of whether to do that or not has consequences that are purely practical, but that feel moral because of everything the story has built up to. The Lonesome Road, the fourth DLC and the one that brings the courier's story to its personal conclusion, is set in a location called The Divide, a region of the Mojave that was destroyed years before the events of the main game. The destruction was something the player character did unknowingly in a job before the events of New Vegas, delivering a package that triggered warheads buried in the Divide's ground, turning a nascent community into a crater. Ulysses, who survived that destruction, built a community there that was destroyed by what the courier delivered. The DLC is a journey through the ruins of a place you destroyed without knowing it, toward a confrontation with someone whose grief about that destruction is completely legitimate. The writing of Ulysses is precise about what he is and isn't. He's not simply wrong. His grief is real, and his understanding of the courier's role in the Divide's destruction is accurate. What he's planning to do in response is terrible, but the game doesn't dismiss his reasoning. The conversation that can conclude the DLC, if the player takes the persuasion options, is a genuine attempt to address Ulysses' arguments rather than simply overpower him, and the dialogue acknowledges the legitimacy of his pain while arguing against his solution. It's the kind of ending that requires the player to have paid attention to the whole DLC rather than just the final fight. Part 22. When the story speaks to the world. Fallout as a franchise has consistently engaged with its real-world context, not in ways that feel opportunistic or preachy, but in ways that emerge organically from the specific premise of a world that froze at the 1950s and then burned. The franchise's ongoing relevance owes something to how the world of the 2020s and beyond has come to resemble, in certain respects, the world that Fallout was describing. Concentrated corporate power. Political polarization that makes constructive collective action difficult. Resource competition at global scale. The gap between the cheerful optimism of official messaging and the lived reality of people navigating systems that are not designed with their well-being as the priority. The Fallout world's specific irony, the friendly propaganda wrapped around a corrupt and destructive system, feels less like satire and more like social observation with each passing year. This wasn't entirely planned. Tim Kaine and the original team were drawing on the cultural atmosphere of the mid-1990s, when American triumphalism after the Cold War's end was at its peak, and before the complications of the following decades had arrived. The specific critique of corporate power and government propaganda that the Fallout world embodies was shaped by the anxieties of that specific moment. What's remarkable is that the critique has aged so well that the specific things the franchise was concerned about have not diminished in relevance. The Amazon series has amplified this dimension of the franchise in ways that feel specifically contemporary. The pre-war corporate world depicted in the show's flashbacks is recognizable not just as a historical aesthetic, but as a structural template for current conditions. The Vault system's cover story, the idea that private enterprise can be trusted to manage the survival of civilization, and that the public should simply trust the corporate entities making those decisions, is a joke that the audience can be counted on to understand. This relevance is one of the things that makes Fallout durable beyond its status as an entertaining game franchise. It's a universe that has a consistent and honest perspective on the relationship between individual human beings and the large institutions that claim to act on their behalf. That perspective isn't simple or politically simple in the way that partisan media tends to be. It doesn't say the left has the answers or that the right does. It says that concentrated power tends toward abuse regardless of ideology, that institutions designed to serve end up serving themselves, and that the people who suffer most from institutional failure are the ones with the least capacity to protect themselves from it. The games have always left space for the player to respond to this perspective in their own way. You can side with the NCR and try to make democratic institutions work better. You can side with Caesar and try the alternative of imperial order. You can try to take power for yourself. You can try to reject all of the options and carve out a space where none of the large institutions have authority. The games let you make these choices and show you their consequences. What they don't do is tell you that any of the major options is straightforwardly correct. That restraint is what makes the franchise worth returning to, and worth thinking about, and worth spending 3 hours in the middle of a quiet night listening to someone talk about. The Wasteland asks questions that are genuinely difficult, and that we're still working on, in our own world, with our own institutions, and our own accumulated mistakes. The bombs haven't fallen. That's the only difference. The rest we're working out in real time, which is a good place to stop. We've wandered through most of what this franchise contains tonight, from its origins in one tired programmer's morning routine to the ruins of Washington, D.C., and the casinos of New Vegas, and the corridors of the Institute, and the mountains of West Virginia, and the Sierra Madre, and Zion Canyon, and all the places between. It's a lot of world for a franchise that started as a side project that a publishing company almost didn't notice. If you're still awake and you made it this far, drop your location and local time in the comments. There's something grounding about knowing where in the world these hours are being kept. A like helps this find its way to more people who might need a long, quiet story to drift off to. And subscribing means you'll be here for the next one, wherever it goes. Sleep well. The Wasteland endures, and so do you. A note on time, the franchise's relationship with its own history. There's a quality that the best Fallout games have, one that's easy to feel and hard to name, which is a specific awareness of time as a weight that the world carries. The 200 years since the Great War isn't just a setting detail. It's a presence in every ruin, and every skeleton, and every terminal entry, and every piece of music still playing in an empty building. Games don't often manage this. Most games that feature ruins feel like ruins designed as backdrop, rather than ruins with specific histories. The way Fallout's world makes you feel the actual elapsed time, the sense that real decades passed in this space before you arrived, is a craft achievement that deserves recognition beyond the more easily celebrated elements like writing and combat design. Part of how it's achieved is the very specific visual language of the world's decay. Different materials deteriorate at different rates, and the Bethesda art teams have applied this knowledge consistently. Concrete endures, wood does not. Paper deteriorates fastest. Metal rusts at rates that depend on exposure. Synthetic materials from the 1950s era often remain identifiable despite degradation. Plastic has a specific aging quality that reads differently from metal or glass. Walking through a Fallout ruin, you can reconstruct something of the room's history from the decay pattern of its contents. The metal shelving still recognizable, the wooden furniture long collapsed, the paper documents legible only in fragments, the pre-war plastic bottles still intact on the floor near where the wooden shelves used to be. The skeletal remains of people are distributed throughout the world in ways that tell stories without words. 2 skeletons found together in a basement, their position suggesting they were holding on to each other when they died. A skeleton behind a locked door in a room with evidence of careful preparation. Food stores, water containers, a journal that ends abruptly. A skeleton in a playground, smaller than an adult's, in a posture that's difficult to think about for too long. The games don't call attention to these. They're just there. They require the player to bring their own interpretation. The terminals, as we've discussed, give voice to the absence. But what's equally powerful is the absence itself. The places where there should be a terminal entry and there isn't, where the story stopped before it could be recorded. A terminal that ends mid-sentence. A holotape that goes silent before whoever was speaking has said what they were trying to say. These gaps are present in every Fallout game, and they create a different kind of affect than the completed stories, an affect built on what's missing rather than what's there. This sensitivity to absence is one of the things that makes the franchise's environmental storytelling so durable. The spaces the games build are not just full of things that are there. They're full of the shapes of things that are missing, of the outlines of lives and objects and interactions that happened and then stopped. You're not just exploring what survived the apocalypse. You're exploring the negative space of what didn't. The music in abandoned buildings plays to empty rooms. The automated voices in commercial establishments continue their welcome messages to no one. The propaganda posters continue urging support for a war that ended 200 years ago. The product advertisements in empty stores continue their sales pitches to customers who are dead. All of this automatic continuation, all of these systems running without the people they were designed to serve, creates a specific portrait of what it looks like when the context for a culture disappears while the culture's artifacts remain. In one sense, the Fallout world is a meditation on artifacts, on what outlasts people and what doesn't, on what was built to endure and what endures accidentally, on what gets preserved because it was important and what gets preserved because it was simply sturdy. The bottle caps endure because they're metal. The holotapes endure because they were designed for resilience. The robots endure because they were built to last. The music endures because it was transmitted and stored and found its way into power sources that have outlived their context. The people are gone. What they made is still here, and what they made continues to tell the story of who they were, in fragments, in the quiet of empty buildings, in the spaces between the things that survived and the things that didn't. This is, in the end, what the Fallout franchise has always been about, in every game and in every piece of lore and in the television series that's carrying the story into a new medium. Not the nuclear war, not the factions, not the power armor or the perks or the settlements. The franchise is about the persistence of the human mark on the world, about what endures when the people who made it are gone, about what those remains can tell us about the people who lived here before things went wrong. And in that meditation, it turns out, the franchise has been telling a story not just about a fictional future that went badly, but about the present we actually inhabit and the past that shaped it. We live among the artifacts of people who are gone. We navigate structures built by generations who had different values and different circumstances than we do. We encounter the evidence of choices made before we arrived, choices we didn't make and can't unmake, choices that determine a significant amount of what our options are. The Fallout world just makes this visible in ways that are harder to look away from. The ruins are explicit. The evidence is everywhere and unavoidable. The artifacts are marked with their origins in ways that real-world artifacts rarely are. There's no uncertainty about what that propaganda poster was for or what that vault was built to do. In our world, the equivalent mysteries are more obscure, more layered, more deniable. But they're not absent. The ruins are just better camouflaged. Which is why, after everything, after 3 decades of games and now a television show, and the promise of more to come, the franchise still has something to say. Something that is not easily said in simpler forms, and that the post-apocalyptic wasteland, for all its genre trappings, has proven to be a uniquely effective way of articulating. War never changes, the games begin. But the people who live in its shadow have to, or they don't survive. Most of them try to survive. A few of them manage it in ways that create something worth having. That fraction of possibility, that thin margin of better outcomes, is what the wasteland keeps asking about and what keeps players returning to find out. Tonight we found out together. Rest now.